I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in the saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 626: Torpedo Attack Aircraft. Charles ate dinner on the plane, a few slices of cake and a jar of fruit syrup, a luxury for Charles who usually ate dry bread. However, eating in the open cockpit of the Avro wasn't easy. Charles had to crouch in the small belly of the plane, like a thief, stuffing food into his mouth. He didn't even dare open the syrup, worried that any turbulence would splatter it all over him. After dark, the group, including the 4 escorting camel fighters, landed smoothly in Paris. The location wasn't the flying club's airport, but the aircraft manufacturing plant. Eric, having received the news, brought men to greet Charles. He rushed to see the plane land, his steps light and his face full of anticipation and joy. However, when he saw Charles jump off the plane, he was stunned. The young man's entire demeanor was different, not just because of his general's uniform, but because of his confident, upright posture and composed gaze, as if looking down on everyone around him from a different perspective. "What's wrong, Uncle Eric?" Charles stepped forward and patted Eric on the shoulder. "Don't you recognize me?" "Yes, General." Eric seemed a little flustered. You seem like a different person. People always change," Charles replied, sighing inwardly. He understood Eric's sense of unfamiliarity. It was the maturity honed by the battlefield and political struggles. Even Charles himself felt his mindset was different from before. Some of the conspiracies he had devised before came at the cost of soldiers and officers' deaths, referring to Blue's power grab. In the past, Charles would never have chosen such cruel methods. But now, he used them without even a hint of guilt. The reason was simple: Charles had seen this world clearly. He knew that to survive here, he had to stop at nothing, or he would become a fish to be slaughtered. Eric led Charles into the office, and Charles immediately sat down by the fireplace to warm himself. He was almost frozen after flying for hours. Looking up, Charles watched in surprise as Eric walked towards the bookshelf. He moved several books from one shelf and retrieved a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses from a hidden compartment. "Would you like a glass?" Eric smiled and gestured with the bottle. "Margot from Bordeaux, of course," Charles replied, then added, "I thought you'd given up drinking." Eric smiled and placed a glass on the coffee table beside Charles, pouring the wine while answering with a smug air, "It's my secret." Charles smiled knowingly. It seemed Eric had gone to great lengths to conceal it. Or rather, Mrs. Eric actually knew, but as long as Eric controlled his intake, she turned a blind eye. "The aircraft manufacturing business is doing very well," Eric said, sitting down opposite Charles, raising his glass to lightly clink against Charles's, his eyes filled with respect and gratitude. "We've reached the top of the industry, General. People all over the world come to us to buy aircraft. I never dreamed the factory could grow to such a level." Charles hummed in agreement. This was within his expectations. Other domestic aircraft manufacturers were simply no match for Charles's. Internationally, even the world's leading power, Britain, had to purchase aircraft from Charles. The top of the industry was undisputed. Note, at this time, the world's leading industrial power was the United States, but because the US was not involved in the war, its military industry and technology lagged behind Europe, remaining large but not strong. However, Charles wasn't interested in this. He said, "I'm not here for business, Uncle Eric." Charles didn't expect the aircraft manufacturing plant to make money. After deducting the investment in research and development, little was left. He would only expect it to be profitable after the full-scale air war with Germany began and combat losses increased significantly. But it was indispensable, because it was the most important strategic equipment, something that couldn't be measured in money. Eric wasn't surprised at all. He chuckled. "Is it because there are new demands on the battlefield?" Charles gave Eric a surprised look. Eric raised his chin. "Come on, General, it's not hard to guess. The engine has reached 225 horsepower, and everyone's guessing what new aircraft you'll produce, especially the people at the Research Institute." Charles said, "Oh," realizing it was because of the engine upgrade. I might have to disappoint you, Charles smiled. Currently, our fighters are still ahead of the enemy. Simply modifying them to have enclosed cockpits will further increase speed. There's not much need for a new model. He paused, then added, however, I think the research institute should be more specialized. Yes, Eric agreed. I had the same idea. They should design aircraft while upgrading engines. The two can be separated. In the early stages of aircraft development, everyone is an expert, usually knowing a little bit of everything. But as development progresses and technology matures, and equipment becomes more advanced, it's neither necessary nor possible for everyone to be a jack of all trades. Specialization is key to better and more professional development. Charles added, we also need to add a torpedo attack aircraft research and development department. This was Charles's main purpose for visiting the aircraft manufacturing plant. A torpedo bomber. Eric was taken aback. A new model? Charles had just said there weren't any new models. No, not a new model. Charles's answer was simple and clear. Just use the Caproni bomber, replace its engines with 200 horsepower ones, and let it carry torpedoes. Historically, Italy used the Caproni to carry an 800-kilogram torpedo when the engines were upgraded to 150 horsepower. The three engines had a total horsepower of 450. However, carrying it was somewhat difficult, the speed was slow, and all machine guns and unnecessary equipment had to be removed. Now, Charles replaced the engines with 200 horsepower ones, bringing the total horsepower to 600, which was more than enough to carry a heavy torpedo. Eric was stunned for a long time before he could react. He said with difficulty, General, you mean, use bombers to carry torpedoes to attack warships? He had always thought that bombers could only be used for land warfare, but he didn't expect them to be used in naval warfare, and specifically to attack warships. Charles was somewhat confused. Wasn't using fighter jets and bombers in naval warfare normal? Then, upon further reflection, it became clear that this very concept was ahead of its time. Naval warfare at that era involved almost no fighter planes. If any were used, they were primarily for reconnaissance. Their machine guns were ineffective against heavily armored warships, so no one paid much attention to the development of naval aircraft. This wasn't just limited to the sea. During World War I, many people were skeptical about the role of aircraft on land. Chapter 627. This is not a coincidence, but an inevitability. I've already reached an agreement with the Brest shipyard, Charles explained. They will provide the aircraft manufacturer with torpedoes and technical personnel. Our R&D department will be responsible for mounting the torpedoes onto the aircraft and ensuring their effective deployment. This was a proposal Charles made at the shipyard. Charles didn't tell Wells more details. He only told Wells that torpedoes would be used and their performance further improved. Since Charles had previously provided torpedo design concepts and torpedo explosive formulations, Wells had no suspicions. Even if he had suspicions, there was nothing he could do. Charles had become the core of the French Navy's development direction, and any problems that arose in the future would still need Charles's solutions. Now that Charles was only making a request, how could he dare to refuse? No problem, Eric readily agreed. We'll set up this torpedo attack aircraft R&D department tomorrow. He already had a preliminary concept in mind. This would require several modified Caproni bombers, a suitable body of water for testing, and ideally, the area should be sealed off. Charles outlined a general experimental direction. Initially, we can use models with equal weight, shape, and specific gravity for testing. The first phase requires ensuring the torpedo enters the water with the optimal attitude. Eric was somewhat confused. He understood why model testing was necessary. Torpedoes were expensive and couldn't be dropped haphazardly from the start. But, General, what does equal specific gravity mean? Eric asked. It refers to the weight of different parts of the torpedo, Charles explained. The weight of the propellant in the head may differ from the weight of the compressed air and combustion chamber in the rear, potentially resulting in a head-heavy torpedo configuration. This could affect its entry attitude when dropped at high speed by a bomber. Eric instantly understood. So, we need to make some adjustments based on the situation, and if necessary, change the layout. Right, yes, Charles nodded. Furthermore, we need to strengthen the internal components of the torpedo, because the impact upon entry into the water could damage certain parts, causing malfunctions. This was one of the problems with early American air-launched torpedoes in World War II. This flaw directly resulted in extremely demanding launch conditions for American air-launched torpedoes. Torpedo bombers had to maintain a straight flight, low altitude, and a very low speed. This made American torpedo bombers almost suicidal in the war. Warships during World War II were generally equipped with air defenses, but torpedo bombers, flying at low altitudes and low speeds along predictable straight trajectories, became easy targets for anti-aircraft machine guns and cannons. This was one of the reasons why the U.S. was completely overwhelmed by the Japanese Navy in the early stages of the Pacific War. However, on second thought, Charles felt that the requirements in this regard didn't need to be too high at this time. After all, anti-aircraft guns hadn't been invented yet, and warships were only equipped with a small number of non-specialized machine guns and cannons, making it almost impossible to hit targets. Note, hitting targets in the air in three-dimensional space is not as simple as it seems. One of the difficulties is that the gunner cannot see the trajectory of the bullets or shells, so they cannot judge whether they have missed or how much they have missed, and therefore cannot correct the trajectory and can only rely on intuition. The solution is to use tracer rounds to assist in firing. Eric listened and nodded repeatedly to show that he understood. Charles's explanation made him realize what the research institute was going to do. Meanwhile, he thought to himself, if this bomber succeeded, the entire naval warfare model could be completely overturned. Those German battleships, each displacing tens of thousands of tons, could be easily dealt with by a single torpedo dropped by one of these aircraft. What Eric didn't know was that Charles wasn't thinking about the Germans, but rather the British. With torpedo bombers, the La Manche Strait would undoubtedly be under French control, and the British fleet wouldn't even be able to get close within 300 kilometers of the coast. Anyone who did would become a target for the torpedo bombers. Note, the Caproni bomber had a range of 600 kilometers, with a maximum launch range of about 300 kilometers. Inside the officers' club, the lights were dim, and the officers were engaged in lively discussion. The topic, of course, was Charles's latest achievement, the Hasselt flanking maneuver. This is another perfect victory. We captured even more Germans this time than in Antwerp. That's not the important thing, Field. The important thing is that this is the second successful infiltration. Yes, many people thought the Antwerp infiltration was due to the Germans being caught off guard, therefore it couldn't be replicated or widely used as a tactic. But now it's proven that this is completely wrong. It can be replicated. But some still express doubt. What if this is just another coincidence? Yes, the Germans are still caught off guard. They've moved their main force to attack Antwerp. I heard the Germans at Hasselt only have 2 infantry regiments. Gerald, returning from delivering drinks, placed the tray on the bar and complained to Lucia, who was busy inside. Can't they talk about something else? Is Charles the only man in the world? Lucia glared at Gerald. You can plug your ears or shut your mouth. Gerald laughed. I forgot. There's someone here who just wants to hear about Charles, and never gets tired of it. Lucia slammed the prepared cocktail onto a tray, pushed it in front of Gerald, and said menacingly, Table 3, get out of my sight. Gerald turned around, caught a glimpse of Charles entering, and turned back to whisper sarcastically, I hope you can say the same thing to him. Lucia followed Gerald's gaze, and she could hardly believe her eyes. Shouldn't Charles be in Hasselt at this time? Before Lucia could react, Charles was surrounded by officers. General, it's Lieutenant General Charles. He really came. Congratulations, General, you've achieved another incredible victory. This time, the officers weren't as considerate as before in giving Lucia time and space. They bombarded her with questions. General, can you tell us about this battle, and the Antwerp infiltration? That's not a coincidence, is it? But both of these happened when the Germans were unprepared. Charles understood the officers' mentality. They wanted an answer, a convincing one, or rather, a theory they might use when they went to the battlefield someday. Not just to save their lives, but also to potentially create a miracle like Charles's. Charles nodded to Lucia, signaling her to wait a moment, then walked into the crowd and sat down with the officers. This is no coincidence, gentlemen, Charles said, but an inevitability, including the Germans' lack of preparedness. The officers were all stunned. How could a lack of preparedness be inevitable? Could the Germans simply patch this loophole by being more vigilant and taking targeted measures next time? Chapter 628 Defense is greater than defense. Someone opened a bottle of beer and handed it to Charles. France's best-selling 1664. The image above shows 1664 beer, founded in 1664, famous for its golden pale ale and 5% alcohol content. Thank you. Charles nodded to the young major who handed him the beer. The young major looked to be in his early 20s, with a mature air about him. and was looking at Charles with eager anticipation, his eyes burning with fervor. "You're welcome, General," the young major replied. "I've been waiting here for over a month, just wanting to know the answers to these questions." The surrounding officers smiled knowingly. They frequented this club, more or less hoping to talk to Charles like this and learn something. Charles wasn't in a hurry. He took a sip of the beer. It was ice cold, making him shiver involuntarily. "Gentlemen," Charles put down his wine bottle and asked calmly, "first, we should consider this question. Do you think defense or offense is more advantageous in actual combat?" This question stumped the officers. It was a question they had been debating, but had never reached a satisfactory answer. After a while, an officer replied, "I believe offense is more advantageous, General, because offense boosts the morale of the soldiers. Yes, with artillery preparation and tanks, offense is the true path to victory." The lieutenant general's infiltrations of Antwerp and Hasselt were indeed offensive maneuvers, which proves that offense is the correct approach. Although they cited Charles's infiltration examples, they were thinking of Foch's theory of offense, some even considering Charles's victory as empirical evidence of the correctness of Foch's theory. After all, Charles had indeed won through offense. But this was immediately countered by another group of officers. "I believe defense has the advantage. For example, in the Battle of the Somme, the Germans inflicted 100,000 British casualties in a single day. Yes, that's obvious. Defense has the advantage of terrain, and with proper firepower, it can inflict far more casualties on the enemy, sometimes several times, even dozens of times more." I agree. After all, the defending side can shoot from their trenches, making the attacking side easy targets. General Peytain's victory at Verdun proves this. This group of officers mostly belonged to Peytain's faction. At this point, many rank-and-file soldiers preferred to believe in defense theory because it better reflected reality and their mindset. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been mutinies among the frontline soldiers. After the debate among officers like Charles subsided, they analyzed, in actual combat, defense is more often than offense. The side that initiates the attack often suffers higher losses, and they may even pay a heavy price without advancing the defensive line. The officers nodded in agreement. This was the reality of trench warfare. Both sides dug trenches and faced each other, unable to gain the upper hand. Many attacks only resulted in increased casualties. This was a fact that even the theory of offense could not deny. However, Charles abruptly changed the subject, saying, "But this is only the tactical situation, gentlemen. What I want to say is that, strategically, offense outweighs defense." The officers exchanged bewildered glances, confused by Charles's sudden reversal. Why would he say offense outweighs defense when defense was clearly more advantageous? Charles calmly picked up the knife and fork from the table and began to explain. "This is the enemy's defensive line, and this is our defensive line. To defend against the other's attack, both sides need to construct complete defensive lines without any gaps, otherwise, the enemy will break through these gaps and expand their gains." The officers nodded in agreement. This was indeed the situation on the Western Front at that time. Charles continued, "This defensive line is over 700 kilometers long, with both sides deploying over 1 million troops. Even so, the quality of the soldiers at the front is uneven, and many places are understaffed and unprepared. It's just that neither side has noticed." The officers nodded again. Many of them had returned from the front lines, some more than once, and they knew Charles was telling the truth. Finally, Charles concluded, "This situation arises because the defending side needs to defend every single point, but defending every point along a 700-kilometer-long defensive line is practically impossible. It's beyond human capability. On the other hand, the attacking side only needs to observe constantly, find a weakness in the 700-kilometer-long defensive line, and then break through to achieve victory. This is what I mean by offense is greater than defense." The officers suddenly understood and nodded in agreement. This is easily explained using the Chinese proverb, "Even the wisest person can make a mistake, and even the most foolish person can have a stroke of genius." The defender is the wise man who believes 1,000 plans cannot afford a single mistake, while the attacker is the fool who believes 1,000 plans can be won with just one stroke of genius. Then an officer cheered. "The lieutenant general is right. Offense is greater than defense proves General Foch is correct. This is further evidence for the offensive theory." "No," the young major immediately objected. Lieutenant General Charles's offense is greater than defense is different from General Foch's offensive theory. General Foch's offensive theory unilaterally emphasizes the advantages of offense without considering other factors, while Lieutenant General Charles's offense is greater than defense means that we will definitely find weaknesses in the enemy's defenses, and then use those weaknesses as a base to break through and expand our gains. Charles inwardly praised the major. At least he didn't simply categorize theories into offense and defense like the other officers. Then someone asked curiously, "General, but what does the offense is greater than defense theory have to do with your incursions at Antwerp and Hasselt? Haven't you understood yet, Field?" The young major replied. Antwerp and Hasselt weren't part of the original plan. The lieutenant general found weaknesses in the enemy's long defensive lines. As the lieutenant general said, a long defensive line can't be perfect in every aspect. There will inevitably be areas where preparations are insufficient. That's why time and again, the Germans were caught off guard and easily defeated by the lieutenant general's concentrated elite forces. The officers then realized, so all of this wasn't luck or coincidence, but intentional. This shows it's a replicable tactic. This is indeed different from offensive theory. Fantastic. We can also apply this tactic in combat. Chapter 629 Possible Rivals. Charles's theory of offense over defense is common military knowledge in modern times, but few, if any, understand it and dare to put it into practice. Not only in World War I, but even in World War II, countries around the world continued to make similar mistakes. The most famous example is France's Maginot Line, which was easily bypassed by Germany and is still ridiculed today. But France wasn't the only country to make similar mistakes. Before the war, Germany built the Siegfried Line in front of the Maginot Line, and later the Atlantic Wall along the Atlantic coast. The Soviet Union built the Stalin Line. Almost without exception, all these lines failed to achieve their intended, or rather, their expected, function. This was not a coincidence, but inevitable. The reason is offense over defense. These lines were too long. Distributing huge sums of money evenly across hundreds of kilometers inevitably created vulnerabilities, and the defense at each point couldn't be very strong. The enemy, however, could observe them repeatedly until they found a weakness and then concentrate their forces to break it down at that point. The correct approach should be to use the funds allocated for building defensive lines to create armored and mechanized units, just like modern armies, while emphasizing troop deployments via roads, railways, sea, and air. Once fighting breaks out on the front lines, these mobile units can be deployed immediately to where they are needed. As long as the deployment speed is fast enough, even if the defensive line has no bricks or mortar, these units can use their powerful mobility to quickly create an invisible yet ever-present steel defensive line. For example, my country spent a huge sum of money to build a railway to the plateau. In a corner of the officers' club, Charles finally escaped the officers' entanglement and sat opposite Lucia, each with a cup of hot coffee in front of them. "They respect you," Lucia said, her eyes shining with pride. "That's only because I've won a few battles," Charles said casually. "Soldiers are pragmatic, and they have to be too." Lucia nodded slightly, glancing around the room. The officers were enthusiastically continuing their previous discussion, some even eagerly spreading out maps and working on calculations under the lights. "They only respect those who can lead them to victory," Lucia said thoughtfully. "Because that brings them honor and a chance to survive." "Yes," Charles replied, his voice cold. "Ultimately, it all comes down to self-interest, money, power, or even life itself." You're like that too?" Lucia asked, her words carrying a double meaning. "Perhaps," Charles replied, taking a small sip of his coffee. He'd unknowingly drunk too much beer while discussing things with the officers and was feeling a bit dizzy. He hoped the coffee would sober him up. Lucia sighed inwardly, yet she understood. As an intelligence officer, she knew what was going on. Charles was under immense, overwhelming, and brutal pressure. He not only had to deal with the enemy on the battlefield but also navigate relationships with members of parliament, capitalists, and even the British. Each of them was formidable. One wrong move could lead to total defeat or even death. Under these circumstances, Charles had no time or energy to consider emotions, nor could he afford to act on them. That could be his downfall. Sometimes, Lucia wondered how Charles had managed to persevere. Unbeknownst to her, Lucia's eyes reddened slightly. She sighed, looked up at Charles, and leaned closer, lowering her voice to ask, "Your orders, General." Charles put down his coffee, glanced to both sides, and then answered softly, Give the Germans a message. Their code has been broken by the British. Lucia was taken aback. This was no small matter. But she quickly regained her composure and nodded firmly. I'll arrange it immediately. Charles must have his reasons for doing this, just like last time when he leaked merchant ship information to the Germans, resulting in the hunting down of over a dozen submarines. Moreover, this information concerned the British. The lady in white wouldn't feel too much pressure. Charles added, you can also add some details. The U-21 submarine sunk in the Dardanelles Strait didn't have time to destroy its cipher machine. Lucia hummed in agreement. This would increase the credibility of the intelligence. Charles recalled the resolute look on General Winter's face that morning and his reply, don't worry, General. We can handle it ourselves. You seem to have forgotten that the Royal Navy is the most powerful navy in the world. There's nothing we can't solve. Charles knew what General Winter was relying on. The British had salvaged the cipher machine, and all of the German operational plans, even the fleet's location, were under British control. This was why the famous Battle of Jutland had occurred. The British fleet, based on intelligence, had grasped the German fleet's plans and deployed its main force to counter them. Charles wondered, if the Germans suddenly changed the code, would General Winter still be so calm? Would the Royal Navy still be so confident? Would the Minister of Munitions still insist on preventing the French Navy from participating in the blockade against the German Navy? Charles had a strange feeling that the German Navy was his ally, while the Royal Navy was the enemy. Then, Charles took a check from his pocket, 100,000 francs, with a list underneath. I will gradually retire some lightly wounded soldiers. You can incorporate them into the organization. This is the operating budget. Lucia's eyes lit up instantly. Yes, General, the White Lady is a civilian organization. They may have the ability to gather intelligence, but they lack the necessary military skills, to the point that they often lack the ability to protect themselves. Now, Charles has given them a group of veterans from the battlefield, which is like sending charcoal in snowy weather to fill the White Lady's shortcomings. What Lucia didn't know was that Charles gave them more than just veterans. Most of these people were excellent snipers, some of whom were apprentices personally trained by Billy Shin. They were equipped with sniper rifles with scopes and could be transformed into excellent spies and assassins with a little training. Who are our opponents? Lucia asked softly. Lucia was smart. She immediately guessed that the White Lady's mission might be upgraded. You should ask who the possible opponents are. Charles stared into Lucia's eyes. Those who might pose a threat to us, or intelligence agencies, understand. A hint of shock flashed in Lucia's eyes. Intelligence agencies? The British CIA or the Second Directorate of the French General Staff? Then Lucia realized that it was more likely the Second Directorate of the French General Staff. Because the Second Directorate was the eyes and ears of the French government and parliament. Controlling them meant preventing the government and parliament from hearing or seeing anything, or from receiving incorrect information. Chapter 630 Marshal of France. Charles was leaving the officers' club with his guards when he suddenly sensed someone chasing him from behind. General, General, a deep voice called out. Charles stopped and turned around. The guards had already warily taken their rifles from their shoulders and were holding them in their hands. Charles looked closely and saw it was the young major who had analyzed Charles's tactics. Can I speak with you, General? The young major asked eagerly. It won't take up too much of your time. Charles nodded, signaling the guards to let him through. The young major breathed a sigh of relief and stepped forward to state his purpose. I hope to be transferred to your unit for combat, General. To be precise, I hope to join your armored or mechanized forces, even as a soldier. Why? Charles countered. A major as a soldier? That required considerable courage, especially on a battlefield with such a high mortality rate. Because it's almost impossible for me to enter the armored forces through normal channels, the young major replied. Charles knew why. Charles's armored and mechanized force commanders needed soldiers who could understand their roles and tactics. At this time, French tactical thinking was too outdated, too rigid, and too inflexible. Therefore, the commanders of armored and mechanized units are primarily promoted internally, not open to external appointments. Charles asked again, why are you so eager to join the armored forces? The young major replied, because of what you said about offense being greater than defense. I think you didn't fully explain it, did you? Oh, Charles countered with interest. Then, what do you think fully should be? The young major answered confidently, to successfully implement this tactic, It must be your armored and mechanized units, because only they can quickly break through the weaknesses in the enemy's defenses and rapidly expand the gains, ultimately ending the battle before the enemy can react. This was the young major's own thinking. The Western Front was over 700 kilometers long, and this defense line had been fought for over a year, during which countless weaknesses and mistakes occurred. But no one had ever successfully broken through like Charles. Why? It was a highly effective and mobile force, the force Charles had assembled. Therefore, only by joining Charles's forces could this tactic be truly implemented. Charles was somewhat surprised. This major was smarter than he had imagined. "What's your name?" Charles asked. The major stood up and saluted, answering with a strong voice, "Commander of the 156th Infantry Regiment, 39th Infantry Division, General Rattle de Tassigny." "Oh, Major Tassigny," Charles nodded, then suddenly gasped. "Tassigny? Marshal of France." The image above shows Marshal Tassigny of France, aged 25 at the time of the book, a junior officer during World War I, who had participated in several battles and been wounded twice. After considering for a moment, Charles hesitated slightly. "I might assign you to the armored forces of the 6th Army, Major. What do you think?" "Yes, General," Tassigny responded with delight. "Thank you very much, General." He was content as long as he could join Charles's armored forces and be baptized by new tactics. He dared not ask for anything more. "Very good," Charles nodded. The 39th Division was Gallieni's reserve army group. Transferring a major was a minor matter. On the other hand, Christine had been promoted to commander of the 6th Army, and the current commander of the 1st Special Artillery Division was not performing well, which was giving Christine a major headache. He had mentioned to Charles several times that he hoped to transfer someone from the 1st Armored Division. The 1st Special Artillery Division had only recently come under Charles's command, and its tactics were still outdated. Even Christine himself didn't have a very good understanding of tactics. Charles thought that Tassigny might be able to handle the job, and he could let him try being a staff officer first. He took out his pocket watch and checked the time. It was past 8 o'clock in the evening. Gallieni was still awake at this hour. Then Charles suddenly realized that he hadn't visited Gallieni in a while. City Defense Command, Gallieni's headquarters. Although Gallieni had been promoted to Minister of War, he still preferred to return to the City Defense Command, where he could handle some affairs of the Reserve Army Group before resting. Under the lamplight, Gallieni handed the signed documents to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. "Not much to do." "Yes, General," Lieutenant Colonel Fernand replied. "The fighting on all fronts has basically stabilized. The manpower shortage at the front has eased, and we're not needed much." Gallieni hummed in agreement. The main role of the Reserve Army Group was to provide manpower replenishment for the frontline armies. With the front lines stable, the Reserve Army Group could relax. A relieved smile appeared on Gallieni's face. This was all thanks to that little fellow Charles. He had stabilized the situation at Verdun, provided a large number of mines to halt the German offensive, and then advanced 5 kilometers along the Somme River, severely weakening the German army. Not long ago, he had also captured over 200,000 German soldiers in Belgium. It could be said that the stability of the front lines was inseparable from Charles, and France was inseparable from Charles, but those guys in Parliament simply ignored all of this and still regarded Charles as an opponent or even an enemy. Gallieni frowned and sighed, lamenting his isolation and inability to offer Charles further assistance. Just then, familiar footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Gallieni thought he'd misheard. Only when Charles appeared in the light did he jump up in surprise and delight. But he quickly returned to his seat with a grunt, asking coldly, "Lieutenant General, what brings you here? Shouldn't you be in Hasselt? I have something to discuss with you, General," Charles said. "Of course," Gallieni replied expressionlessly. "You wouldn't come here otherwise." Charles felt a little helpless. The old man was annoyed that he hadn't visited him in so long, hence his sarcastic tone. He was getting more and more like a child with age. "General," Charles handed Gallieni a can of coffee beans. "I brought these from Belgium especially for you." Actually, Charles had just bought them from the club, but who knew? However, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand knew the truth, and he looked at Charles with a surprised and questioning gaze. Charles quickly gave him a wink. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand understood, pretending not to notice and continuing to organize his documents. Gallieni's expression softened. "Speak, what's the matter?" "First, I need someone," Charles said, "a major named Tassigny from the 39th Division." Gallieni readily agreed. "Lieutenant Colonel Fernand will take care of it." "Anything else?" "Business," Charles said. "Business?" Gallery looked at Charles, puzzled. The war situation seemed stable enough that there wasn't much need for procurement. Did Charles have some new equipment? Chapter 631 This is what we should do, you're welcome. In Gallieni's lounge at the City Defense Command headquarters, although the headquarters had undergone reorganization, eliminating some spies planted by capitalists and members of parliament, many officers who were just coasting along had gradually infiltrated since Charles left. Because this was a reserve army group with far less wartime danger, Gallieni was helpless. He sat at his desk, accepting the coffee Charles had brewed for him, and said resignedly, "This isn't something one or two people can solve. Many times, I don't even have a reason to transfer them." Charles nodded in understanding. It was a systemic problem. Unless one could create an internal loop during combat, isolating themselves from the outside world, like Charles's troops, most officers graduating from military academies were children of nobles and members of parliament. Where could one find officers with clean backgrounds? Gallery took a sip of coffee, looked up at Charles, and asked curiously, "What kind of business are you referring to?" "Aircraft, General," Charles replied. "We need more aircraft," Gallery said. "Oh," and countered, "How many?" Charles paused briefly, then answered, "Currently, we need to build at least 3 military airfields, each with 1 fighter squadron and 1 bomber squadron, approximately 200 aircraft, at least 200. Gallery looked at Charles in shock. "But I've heard that our air force is enough to suppress the Germans." The implication was that the military currently had no need to purchase more aircraft, let alone so many. Charles understood. France was currently facing a shortage of supplies, and with air superiority secured, the military naturally had no need for more. However, Charles placed a map in front of Gallieni and said to himself, "I plan to build military airfields in these 3 locations, Brest, Seine, and Dunkirk." The red circles on the map above indicate the locations of the Brest shipyard, Seine, and Dunkirk, approximately 200 kilometers apart as the crow flies. Gallieni took off his glasses, put them on, and frowned deeply as he looked at the 3 locations Charles had marked on the map. "I thought you were buying more aircraft and building airfields to place them at the front lines." Placing them at the front lines would be understandable, as it would be beneficial to the war effort, since the newly purchased aircraft were intended for fighting the Germans. But to expend so much effort and money to place them in the rear was something Gallieni found hard to understand. Charles calmly replied, "This is to cooperate with the Royal Navy in blockading the La Manche Strait." "General, blockading the La Manche Strait?" Gallieni laughed. "With the British fleet there, we don't need to worry about that at all." Charles didn't speak, only quietly looking at Gallieni. Gallery was puzzled by Charles's expression, then glanced at the map and suddenly realized, "You're not doing this to deal with the Germans." But, Gallery quickly stopped himself. Walls have ears. It was best not to say dealing with the British, as both understood each other. Charles nodded slightly and replied, "The La Manche Strait is one of the busiest sea lanes in the world, a strategically vital location. Whoever controls the La Manche Strait controls shipping, supplies, and even the initiative in war and political discourse." This was no exaggeration. If Britain lost the La Manche Strait, it would be finished. The reason was the theory of offense over defense. To prevent a French landing on land, Britain would have to fortify every point along the 560-kilometer coastline with fortifications, barbed wire, coastal artillery, infantry guns, trenches, etc. The funds would be enough to build several fleets. And even then, it wouldn't be enough. The French army could still concentrate its forces and break through at a single point. Gallery was stunned speechless for a long time by Charles's grand plan. He looked at the map and then at Charles, secretly shocked. This young man had only just turned 19, yet he had such a big appetite. He wasn't thinking about stopping or defeating the Germans, he was thinking about challenging the world's leading power, with the British Royal Navy, whom the whole world looked up to, as his hypothetical enemy. This was something France hadn't been able to achieve for decades with the entire nation's resources, and he was launching a challenge without any sense of proportion. After considering for a while, Gallery shook his head. "Aircraft aren't very useful in naval warfare, Vice Admiral. At most, they were only for reconnaissance." Charles didn't speak. He took a sketch from the inside pocket of his trench coat and handed it over. It was a sketch he had casually made while discussing details with Eric at the aircraft factory, a Caproni bomber with a torpedo mounted on its belly. Gallery took it and immediately froze, speechless. Although he didn't know much about naval warfare, he knew about torpedoes. Having followed the Dardanelles War, He knew that those seemingly impenetrable battleships could often be sunk with a single torpedo in actual combat. Seeing that bombers could carry torpedoes, he immediately understood. After a long pause, Galini exclaimed, "My God, is this real? Can bombers really do this?" Charles nodded firmly. "The mounting isn't difficult. The main challenge is that the torpedoes themselves might malfunction due to the impact upon impact. We need time to reinforce the torpedo components. Also, there might be requirements regarding the speed, altitude, and attitude of the bomber during the launch, but these are all within acceptable limits." Galini stood up shakily, holding the sketches excitedly, saying, "Fantastic, kid. Unbelievable. Do you know what this means? Our Navy will become #1 in the world. We will have the whole world." "Charles, you're a genius." This was no exaggeration. If bombers carrying torpedoes could destroy battleships, and given their 300-kilometer range, they could blockade most shipping lanes, making it extremely difficult for the powerful Royal Navy to operate. For example, the Strait of Gibraltar. Charles pointed to Dunkirk on the map and said, "The airfield here should be a priority, General. I think we should double the number of fighters and bombers here." Galini glanced at the map and nodded repeatedly. "That's right, double or even triple, or add another airfield in Boulogne or Calais." The red circle on the map above is the Strait of Dover, which France calls the Strait of Calais. It's the narrowest point of the Strait of La Manche, only 34 kilometers wide. Placing fighters and bombers at Dunkirk would both block the Strait of Calais and allow direct bombing of London, posing a threat. Finally, Charles asked Galini, "General, do you think we should purchase 200 more aircraft?" Galini cleared his throat, his smile fading, and replied seriously, "All indications suggest that the German fleet may attempt to break out through the Strait of La Manche. As a member of the Allied powers, I believe we have a responsibility to prepare for this potential danger in advance. Although airplanes aren't very useful in naval warfare, we'd be happy to set up more airfields and deploy aircraft to provide intelligence to our allies. It's what we should do." "You're welcome." Charles, who was just about to drink his coffee, almost spat it out. Chapter 632, Changing the Morse Code. Galini acted swiftly, ordering 200 aircraft through the government the very next day under the pretext of cooperating with the Royal Navy to blockade the La Manche Strait, while the construction of airfields was also put on the agenda. However, most of the aircraft were fighters, with only a few Caproni bombers used for training and testing, to test the Caproni bombers' performance in the high salt, high humidity coastal environment and to make improvements. The British had no objections. At this time, everyone believed that fighter planes had limited uses, merely for gaining air superiority, reconnaissance, and striking enemy supply lines. Moreover, these were mostly limited to land warfare. In naval warfare, they were almost exclusively for reconnaissance. What the British didn't realize was that this was all a Charles conspiracy. Before the British realized the importance of aircraft, Charles preemptively laid the groundwork, easily securing control of the sea and air before the British even perceived the danger. Then, once the airfields were completed and the fighters and torpedo bombers were deployed, the outcome would be decided. At that time, the French Navy, which had been suppressed by the British Royal Navy for decades and could only cower in its naval ports, dared not compete with the Royal Navy for control of the Channel, would finally be able to hold its head high. The British fleet, get out of the way, you fools. Look at those small, dilapidated fishing boats. We don't even need cannons, we can sink you by ramming them. The French fleet, look up at the sky, arrogant British. See the torpedoes hanging from the bombers? If necessary, we can call in dozens, even hundreds. Think about the consequences. The British fleet felt a chill run down their spines. They only knew torpedoes to be fired into the water. The French had actually put them in the air. The guns on their warships were all designed for enemy warships. Only a few bang-bang guns were used for anti-aircraft defense, targeting seaplanes. These were far from sufficient against fighters and bombers. The image above shows the pong-pong gun, which can be considered a larger version of the Maxim gun, 37mm caliber. The British Navy used it in various modifications and tandem firing until World War II. Lacking tracer rounds, it had significant flaws and extremely limited anti-aircraft capabilities. It was only then that the British realized the world's #1 navy had been handed over to the 5th-ranked French Navy. They had always believed that the English Channel, their inland waterway, was completely under French control, and if they refused, this narrow channel would soon become their graveyard, burying the entire Royal Navy. In central London, Uniformed staff officers and secretaries moved about in the War Office building, adding a tense atmosphere to the Edwardian Baroque building. The image above shows the War Office building, built in 1902, now converted into the Raffles Hotel. In the office on the third floor facing the road, the quartermaster and General Winter stared expressionlessly at a map, watching a staff officer calculate the timely position of the German fleet on a nautical chart. "Is the intelligence accurate?" the quartermaster asked. "Yes, very accurate," the staff officer replied. The quartermaster general nodded in satisfaction. During this time, they had been verifying whether the deciphered code matched the actual location of the German fleet. If it matched, it meant the code was correct and the Germans hadn't noticed. This wasn't originally the quartermaster general's responsibility, it was the Admiralty general's. However, the code was closely related to the location of the German submarines, and the quartermaster general's task was to ensure the safety of supplies and escort missions, so he was put in charge of the code. General Winter handed over a telegram. "Your Excellency, the code indicates the Germans have a surprise attack planned for tomorrow. They will send a fleet of 2 battle cruisers and 11 destroyers to attack my third fleet." The third fleet was the British fleet deployed south of the North Sea to blockade the English Channel. It was the weakest of the 3 fleets of the Royal Navy, composed of small to medium tonnage light cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats, primarily tasked with mine-laying and blockade. Then General Winter added, "We should notify the First Minister of the Navy immediately, Your Excellency, or it will be too late." The quartermaster was silent for a moment, then asked slowly, "You mean, have the First Minister of the Navy send reinforcements?" "Yes, of course," General Winter replied. "The Second Fleet can arrive in time." The quartermaster shook his head slightly. "No, General, we shouldn't do that." "Why?" General Winter looked at the quartermaster with suspicion. To prevent the Germans from noticing anything amiss, the quartermaster waved the deciphered telegram in his hand. "Have you considered this? If we can always know the German surprise attack plans in advance and avoid danger, some of which are even decided on the spot, what do you think the Germans will think?" General Winter suddenly understood. The German plan was for tomorrow, and it involved fast battle cruisers and destroyers, which was very likely, as the quartermaster said, just a last-minute surprise attack plan. If even the Royal Navy knew this in advance, it meant an intelligence leak. And it wouldn't be long before the Germans became suspicious of the code. After a moment of silence, General Winter said, "Then we should at least notify the Third Fleet and have them make some preparations." The quartermaster minister again rejected the suggestion, his voice cold. "This is not a rational approach, General. Vice Admiral Avery, commander of the Third Fleet, might use mines to block the shipping lanes for his own safety, or some other underhanded tactics." General Winter understood. The quartermaster minister intended to sacrifice part of the Third Fleet's strength to ensure the continued decoding of the German codes. The quartermaster minister stared at General Winter and said earnestly, "We must do this, General. Holding off the main German force is our true mission, understand?" General Winter reluctantly replied, "Yes, Your Excellency. I will inform the First Minister of the Navy of your suggestion." The outcome was predictable. The First Minister of the Navy would side with the quartermaster minister, and they never hesitated in such matters. At that moment, a staff officer burst in and reported, "Your Excellency, the Germans have changed their codes." "What?" The quartermaster minister and General Winter were shocked. They exchanged glances, neither understanding what had gone wrong. After a moment, the quartermaster frowned and said, "Could it be that we've been dodging submarines too frequently?" General Winter added, "And the French fleet is hunting submarines. The Germans don't know that Charles developed an echo detector, and they can't understand why 12 submarines were sunk at once. This might make them suspect an intelligence leak." The quartermaster nodded slowly. Various possibilities existed, but considering them now was pointless. The key was that the code was unbreakable. They had no way of knowing the Germans' subsequent breakout plan. Chapter 633 Charles B-1 Tank. In the town of Darvaz, Charles woke up refreshed in his bed. He had finished discussing the airport and the purchase of additional aircraft with Gallieri late last night, around 11 p.m. Although the city defense headquarters had prepared accommodations for him, Charles had Major Laurent escort him back to town. He got up and peeked through the curtains, his gaze meeting the world outside. A blanket of snow covered everything. Trees were bent low, their branches adorned with strings of glistening icicles that swayed gently in the breeze, making a soft rustling sound. Occasionally, chunks of snow and icicles would fall, kicking up a cloud of powder beneath the trees. Several children, wearing thick hats and heavy coats, frolicked and played in the snow, their laughter like warm sunshine piercing the cold air, bringing innocence and life to the otherwise quiet town. This was perhaps why Charles hadn't wanted to stay at the city defense headquarters and had rushed back overnight. It wasn't just because of his familiar bed and warm home, nor just because of Djokovic and Camille. It was more like a secluded paradise, far from the war and noise, where he could completely relax and find a moment of peace. After standing for a while, Charles felt a chill and shivered, quickly retreating to his warm bed. Charles had originally planned to stay in bed all day. Nothing was more blissful than lazing around in bed on a cold winter's day. But then he thought of Matthew's Charles B-1 tank under development. They said a prototype would be ready in a month, but more than a month had passed, and he wondered what stage it had reached. Oh well, bed was more comfortable. What did it matter what stage it was at? For now, the Charles A-1 was sufficient, no rush. Then he thought, the Charles B-1 wasn't just for dealing with German tanks. Its 75mm gun would be very beneficial for supporting infantry operations. But then he thought, what good would it do to look at it? Could it speed up the process? Or could it make any other improvements? Bed was more comfortable, going outside meant freezing cold. He struggled with this for a long time, constantly giving himself reasons only to overturn them again and again. Finally, unable to suppress his curiosity, he got up, took out the clean general's uniform he kept at home from the wardrobe, changed, quickly straightened his general's hat in the mirror, and then went downstairs. Camille was clearing the table. When she saw Charles come down, her eyes showed some surprise. Why didn't you sleep a little longer? Your father has already had breakfast and gone to work. They thought Charles was still asleep, so they hadn't woken him. I'm going to the factory, Mother, Charles replied. Camille brought Charles apple pie and milk, her tone reproachful. You should stay home and rest, Charles, even just for a day. Today isn't my holiday, Mother. Charles took a sip of milk and greedily gnawed on the soft, still warm pie. These foods used to never whet his appetite, but now they tasted like rare delicacies. The image above shows apple pie, a classic French dessert bread made with flour and cooked apples, with a crispy crust. There's never enough time to finish, Camille said to Charles. You don't need to put so much pressure on yourself, Charles mumbled in agreement, but inwardly disagreed. Many things require seizing the initiative as quickly as possible, the faster the better, otherwise, falling behind at one step could lead to falling further behind, requiring more time and effort to catch up later, or even being unable to catch up at all. After breakfast, Charles called Laurent to pick him up. He didn't want to walk to the factory in this freezing weather, even though it wasn't far. In the car, Laurent told Charles something. I think you don't know yet, General, Laurent said as he drove, glancing in the rearview mirror and then looking ahead. Pierre is dead. Charles was stunned. Pierre? Who? Then he said, oh, remembering the uncle he had sent to the battlefield. Dead. Charles looked at Laurent in confusion. Soldiers typically don't use the word dead, they respect fallen soldiers. Laurent's tone, however, seemed to carry a hint of disdain. Yes, Laurent nodded, it happened last week, General. At Verdun, he was supposedly terrified by enemy fire, dropped his gun, and tried to flee, only to be killed by the overseers. Charles then understood Laurent's tone. Soldiers despised cowardly soldiers. The townspeople don't talk about it often, Laurent explained. They consider it a disgrace, and I don't think your parents mentioned it either, Charles hummed in agreement. Another reason was likely the sheer number of casualties. Deserters like Pierre, killed by the overseers, would soon be forgotten. The car carved two long tracks into the pristine snow as it entered the factory gate. Amidst the swirling snowflakes, several hunched guards, stamping their feet in the cold wind, quickly lined up and saluted Charles in the back seat. Charles casually returned the salute. Everything was as usual. Pierre's death didn't stir any ripples in his heart. Charles was just a little surprised that this guy, who only knew how to indulge in debauchery, was still alive. It was quite remarkable. At the tractor factory's R&D department, Charles saw several tanks as soon as he entered. Two were parked to the side, and one was in the middle of an open space. The air was filled with the unpleasant smell of gasoline, as if they had just been test-driven. Charles looked them over. They were indeed Charles B-1s, looking more like modern tanks. Hey, Charles, Matthew limped up to him with a smile. How's everything? Fine, Charles replied. Then he felt something was off. Matthew didn't seem surprised to see him at all. You knew I'd come, Charles asked. Matthew shrugged. Your father told me you were back." He then nodded towards the tank in the middle of the room. "I believe you want to see her." Matthew's face beamed with pride as he handed the prepared data file to Charles. "These are her test data?" Charles took the file and glanced at it. The frontal armor had been increased to 60 mm, easily withstanding German tank guns and even close-range fire from 77 mm infantry guns. Furthermore, its maximum speed was 28 km per hour, significantly faster than the Charles A1. "Very good," Charles nodded in satisfaction, flipping through the file. Higher speed was more advantageous for infiltration operations. The only problem was that this tank weighed 31 tons, which would obviously place higher demands on bridges, roads, and the battlefield environment. Charles handed the file back to Matthew, walked around the Charles B1 twice, patted the rear, and said to Matthew, "Bring a log here, along with some high-strength steel cables." "A log? Steel cables?" Matthew was taken aback. What were these things for? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 634 Self-Rescue Wood. Charles initially thought he wouldn't need to explain much to Matthew, he just needed to produce the steel cables and prepare the logs. But upon closer inspection, he realized something was amiss. If he didn't explain anything, Matthew wouldn't know the specifications and hardness of the logs, or the strength of the steel cables, all of which required extensive testing to determine the data before mass production. So, Charles patiently explained to Matthew, tanks weighing 31 tons will inevitably encounter many problems while moving, especially in extreme weather conditions. For example, in heavy snow in winter, tanks can easily slip and become stuck in puddles, and during the rainy season, tanks often get stuck in mud and can't move. Matthew nodded in agreement. These problems had repeatedly occurred with the St. Simon self-propelled howitzer. But what does this have to do with logs and steel cables? Matthew asked, puzzled. You mean, they can get the tanks out of trouble? Charles nodded firmly. Matthew paused, then suddenly laughed. You're not joking, are you, General? One log isn't nearly enough for a tank stuck like this. We need at least dozens of logs. He was thinking of placing dozens of logs on the muddy road to help the tank pass. Charles didn't say anything. He led Matthew to his desk, picked up paper and pen, and explained while drawing, suppose the tank is stuck in a ditch or mud and can't get out. Here's what we can do. First, tie the log to the tank tracks with a steel cable, then start the tank, and the tracks will pull the log backward. The image above shows the self-rescue log component in its state when tied to the tracks. The image above shows the self-rescue log carried by the tank. Matthew suddenly understood. Then the reaction force of this log will help the tank get out of trouble. Yes, Charles replied, but there are a few things to note. The log must be strong enough, otherwise it will be easily crushed. It must be slightly wider than the tank so that the steel cable can be tied on. At the same time, the steel cable must be strong enough, otherwise it will easily break. Most importantly, once the log runs under the road wheels, you must stop, untie the steel cable first, and then continue moving forward, otherwise the log will hit the tank body as the tracks rotate. Matthew stared blankly at Charles, unsure if he was listening. After a while, he suddenly snapped out of his daze and asked, General, how did you know about this method? This tank has only just been produced, it hasn't encountered similar difficulties yet. I mean, shouldn't we encounter difficulties first, and then find a solution? Charles had a solution before the problem even arose. The Charles A1 occasionally encounters this situation, Charles rambled on. The usual method is to fill the mud with stones and then use other vehicles to help it get out. At that time, I was thinking, could there be a simpler way to get itself out? Matthew nodded slowly, genuinely praising. Indeed, it's a simple method, a very good method. It doesn't require any auxiliary vehicles or manpower, it can do it all by itself. This is very suitable for use on the battlefield, because there's often no opportunity to rely on others. During battle, everyone is busy attacking the enemy and fighting. It's unlikely and impossible to rescue a tank stuck in the mud, even in the second line or rear. If a unit has multiple tanks stuck, it's easy for traffic to become congested or chaotic. If the tanks could get themselves out of the mud, it would undoubtedly save a lot of trouble. Charles pushed the sketches towards Matthew. What you need to do is trial produce the self-rescue log, conduct some necessary tests, and then apply it to the tanks after it's suitable. Is that all right? No problem, Matthew answered confidently. Charles then took the sketches again, thoughtfully adding, also, we can install a telephone at the rear of the tank. A telephone? Matthew looked at Charles in surprise. Who can we call with it? Tanks are mobile? Do we expect them to drag telephone lines around? No, Matthew, Charles calmly replied. They don't need to call anyone in particular. The infantry only need to call the tank crew inside the tank to enhance infantry-tank cooperation. Matthew suddenly understood, his eyes widening in astonishment before he exclaimed, great idea, Charles, install a telephone. It's not expensive, and it doesn't require much technology, but it can give infantry-tank cooperation a qualitative leap. You're a genius, Charles. The two images above show telephones installed at the rear of modern tanks for infantry-tank cooperation. Actually, Charles had thought of installing telephones on tanks long ago. Since the invention of the tank, infantry-tank coordination has been a major problem, especially in infiltration warfare where tanks sometimes have to fight at night, such as during the attack on Antwerp. Equipping tanks with telephones could effectively solve this problem, even giving them basic night fighting capabilities. Infantry could use the telephone to direct the tank's advance and indicate targets. However, Char never did this. The reason was that the Germans faced greater difficulties with tank coordination. The A7V tank had a crew of 18, the Upper Silesia tank had 5, and even the recently developed LK-1 light tank required 3 crew members. The Char A1, on the other hand, only had 2 crew members. Fewer crew members meant simpler coordination, especially since the Char A1 had significant advantages in various aspects, and the 1st Panzer Corps had spent a considerable amount of time training infantry tank coordination. If Char had equipped tanks with telephones, the Germans would have benefited more. In that case, the Char A1 might not only have failed to gain an advantage over enemy tanks, but might have actually closed the gap. The Char B1 heavy tank was different. Its crew required 4 people, making coordination much more difficult. More importantly, the 75mm gun of the Char B1 tank was primarily designed for infantry coordination, and adding a telephone to enhance tank infantry cooperation would be highly beneficial. Even if the Germans learned to use it on their tanks soon, by then their tanks would no longer be facing the Char A1, but the formidable Char B1, mass production next month. No problem, Char asked. No problem, Matthew nodded emphatically. Then, as if remembering something, he added, oh, right, you asked me to send a few people to the Brest shipyard to learn. Char had almost forgotten about this. He had only sent Matthew a telegram, which didn't elaborate, and Matthew was probably completely baffled, having no idea why tank builders would need to learn a naval technology at a shipyard. A two-way stabilized fire control system, Char replied succinctly. It will be useful. You can think of the tank hull as a ship and then install a two-way stabilized fire control system on the turret. Matthew was stunned. Could that really be done? Wasn't that a bit too far-fetched? If this technology succeeded, would German tanks still be a match? Chapter 635 Market Research by the U.S. Military. Charles spent 2 extra days in the town under the guise of tracking tank development. In reality, the 2 tank improvements Charles proposed were technically straightforward and didn't require in-depth discussion. As for the dual stabilized fire control system, that was a long-term plan for the future, not something achievable immediately. These past 2 days, Charles spent more time discussing his business with Joka, primarily the development of American military factories. That afternoon, Charles had just returned to his office from the tank development department when Joka handed him a document from Joseph in the United States. Joseph has set up the factory in New York, Joka said. He believes it's the most suitable production location. Charles took the document and nodded in agreement. This decision was clearly correct. The Western Front was a transportation target, and New York was the closest, largest, and most convenient port to France. When the U.S. military entered the war, it would also deploy troops to the Western Front, requiring equipment to be transported to France. Therefore, the factory couldn't be located in the heart of America simply because business with the U.S. required equipping the U.S. military. The image above shows a map of major global shipping routes. The 2 sections marked in red, when connected, form the western route from New York to France. The entire route takes only 7 to 10 days, with New York being the largest and busiest port, and also the most important port for U.S. reinforcements on the Western Front. America is indeed a good place to set up factories, Joka remarked. It has cheap resources, cheap labor, and complete infrastructure. Charles smiled slightly as he looked at the data in the document. This was quite the opposite of modern America. Modern Americans weren't as hard-working as those of this era. Then Joka changed the subject. But our business isn't going very well. Not going well. Charles looked up at Joka. In what way? Everything. Joka leaned closer, flipped through the document, found the page, and pointed to the data, saying, "This is Joseph's price and purchase volume, along with his market research on the U.S. military." He thinks the results aren't optimistic. Charles glanced at it. All the equipment was being purchased in minimum quantities, with unit prices only a few dollars or a dozen dollars higher, almost no profit. Charles was puzzled. Even though the U.S. military wasn't under war pressure, many of the equipment they lacked should have been urgently needed. Why were they only purchasing so little? For example, the Garand rifle had a crushing advantage over the Springfield rifles currently used by the U.S. military. Then there were the SYNOPSIS light machine guns and mortars. The U.S. military was completely lacking in these areas, yet the procurement was only a few hundred pieces per month. Then, Charles realized the reason. At this time, the entire U.S. military only had 130,000 personnel. Buying a few hundred machine guns and mortars a month seemed like a lot to them. They could equip all 130,000 men in a few months, so there was no rush. However, after reading the market research report on the U.S. military, Charles realized this was only one reason. The U.S. military was actually preparing for war. The military must always be prepared, even if they don't believe they will participate in war. They must train and upgrade their equipment with war as the goal. The reason for the small quantity of equipment was that the U.S. Congress maintained a skeptical attitude towards Charles's equipment. Members of Parliament commented on the Garand rifle. This rifle has too high a rate of fire. It's issued to every soldier, which means each soldier's ammunition consumption will increase, but both Britain and France are currently experiencing ammunition shortages. Once war breaks out, equipping us with such a high rate of fire rifle will undoubtedly put even more pressure on our already fragile supply lines. Most seriously, by purchasing one such rifle, we could buy 3 Springfield rifles to equip 3 soldiers, and the simultaneous firing of 3 soldiers would be enough to compensate for the Springfield's insufficient rate of fire. Note, the Garand rifle costs around $85, while the Springfield rifle costs around $28. Regarding the SYNOPSIS light machine gun, we don't consider it necessary equipment, because we see no advantage this machine gun has over the Maxim machine gun. The Maxim machine gun, although cumbersome, has a much faster rate of fire. And the Germans have proven its value on the Somme battlefield. Regarding the mortar, it's a clumsy and ridiculous weapon, simple, ugly, and more importantly, severely lacking in power and range. Why don't we just buy an infantry gun? Is it any better than an infantry gun? Charles chuckled softly, closed the file, and handed it back to Joka. Joka took the file and looked at Charles, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You don't seem to be in any hurry." Joka felt he understood Charles less and less, even though he was his son. "No, father," Charles answered confidently, his tone full of self-assurance. "We don't need to rush. The situation will change, it's just not the right time yet. Let Joseph continue to expand production." "All right," Joka said helplessly. He was almost certain this was a losing proposition. Charles considered for a moment, realizing that the United States was consciously resisting his military factories. Although those words were spoken by members of Congress, seemingly the ramblings of a bunch of fools who knew nothing about military affairs and had no combat experience, in reality, they weren't that stupid. They could simply send a few people to the Western Front to ask soldiers who had fought in the war, and they would immediately know the function of these equipment. So why were these ridiculous answers and statements appearing? The root cause lay with the American arms companies behind those congressmen. They didn't want Shire's equipment to take over the arms market that rightfully belonged to them. So, even knowing the truth, they used their power and influence to suppress it. Shire initially didn't want to pay attention. He simply waited for the U.S. to enter the war and send troops to the Western Front, where the battlefield would deliver a resounding slap to the American military and expose the congressman's lies. But then he thought, before the lies were exposed, the U.S. military would be buying Springfield rifles in bulk for a considerable period, and even during troop expansion, the government would fund the emergency increase in Springfield rifle production instead of Garand rifles. This meant he would earn significantly less money. No, He had to make the Americans realize the value of the Garand rifle before then. Thinking this, Shire said to Djoka, "We can release a batch of Garand rifles to the civilian population at half price." Half price? Djoka stared at Shire in astonishment. "Are you crazy, Shire? That doesn't even cover the cost." Chapter 636 Free Market Bidding. The sheer number of ammunition planned by Charles startled Djoka. 10,000, Charles said, plus a long-term supply of ammunition. 10,000. Djoka looked stunned, then said after a moment, "Charles, each one incurs a loss of about $10, so 10,000 would be $100,000. It's worth it, father," Charles replied, "and this is only the first batch. More may be provided depending on the situation." "Are you sure?" Djoka swallowed hard. "Yes," Charles said firmly. Djoka had no choice but to draft the telegram as Charles instructed and send it to Joseph. Charles knew the situation in America. At that time, America was in an era of rampant gang activity, and these gangs had developed into large-scale, standardized, and even quasi-military groups, some even boasting tens of thousands of members. The image above shows John Morris, an American mob boss and also a congressman. At the time, American mob bosses often used their popularity to run for senator, achieving influence over both the legal and illegal worlds. After Roosevelt took office, he began cracking down on the rampant gangs, arresting over 5,000 gang leaders alone. These 10,000 Garand rifles, released to the public at half price, would undoubtedly strengthen the gangs. Meanwhile, the U.S. military only had 130,000 men, armed with Springfield rifles but lacking light machine guns and submachine guns. It's easy to imagine that even if the military were deployed, it would be difficult to contend with gangs equipped with Garands in a war. At that point, would there be any need to worry about the U.S. military not being equipped with Garands? Shire could even have the gangs and the government bid for the rifle. Free competition, respect for the market? Then the highest bidder wins. That's right, let's do it that way, and don't come begging to me later. After thinking for a moment, Charles added, "Also, share some of the Garand rifle tactics with the civilians, such as the tactic of 3 rifles taking turns firing to suppress machine guns, and it would be best to share some tactics for alternating firing and coordinated operations." Djoka looked completely bewildered. These were tactics used on the battlefield, yet Charles wanted to share them with the American civilians. What use could that be? Charles, however, thought to himself, "Godfathers, it's up to you. You must live up to expectations." Just as Charles and Djoka were further discussing the development of other equipment, a phone call came in. Djoka answered the phone, listened for a while, covered the receiver, and turned to Charles, his face beaming with pride. "It's the guard outside. General Winter wants to see you." Although Djoka didn't know who General Winter was, the guard told him it was a vice admiral, a British vice admiral. Good heavens, a British vice admiral actually came to see Charles. Could it be that Charles's reputation had already reached Britain? That's the world's strongest Royal Navy. Djoka had expected Charles to be overjoyed or flattered, and to quickly rise and greet him. Instead, Charles simply replied, "Let him in." Djoka was taken aback. He's your friend." He worried that Charles's coldness might be disrespectful to the British Royal Navy Vice Admiral. His words implied that Charles should be more polite. However, Charles remained unconcerned. "He's not much of a friend. I've helped him win a few battles, and this time he's probably asking for my help again." Djoka's eyes went black. The British Royal Navy actually needed Charles's help in battle? Had he misheard? But what happened next forced Djoka to believe Charles. General Winter entered with a smile, carrying a gift. He warmly shook hands with Djoka upon entering. "Hello, Mr. Djoka, I am a friend of Charles's. I hope you won't mind my unannounced visit. This is a small gift for you, please accept it." Djoka, holding the gift box, seemed at a loss. He glanced at Charles, and only dared to accept it after Charles nodded. After Djoka left, he opened the box and discovered it contained a valuable Swiss pocket watch. However, the point wasn't the watch's value. Djoka didn't care about such a small sum at this moment. The important thing was that Charles was associating with someone of this caliber, and Charles didn't even bother to consider him a friend. Djoka couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Charles seemed to have reached a level he could never have imagined. Inside the office, Charles, acting as the host, made General Winter a cup of coffee and coldly asked, "Did you call me here for something?" "Please, Charles," General Winter said, "when did we become so estranged? I think it's better to be a little distant." Charles said, sitting back in his chair. Like you said, we each have our own interests. One moment we're friends, the next we're enemies. I find it difficult to switch between those roles as smoothly as you do. I simply separate public and private matters, General Winter defended himself. Then, Charles asked, you didn't come here today for personal matters, did you? Of course, General Winter nodded. He had come all the way from London, England. It certainly wasn't for friendship. Charles shrugged. That's it then? Discussing business makes them adversaries, potential enemies. General Winter looked helpless. All right, remember the cipher machine we salvaged from the German submarine in the Dardan Strait? Of course, Charles replied leisurely, taking his coffee. He paused, then asked, did it malfunction? Yes, General Winter sighed. The Germans changed the code. It was bound to happen sooner or later, Charles said calmly. You should have been more discreet, that way, you might have been able to use it for another year or two. Then, as if remembering something, he feigned surprise and looked up, asking, you wouldn't be hoping to use the cipher machine to stop the German Navy's breakout, would you? General Winter smiled wryly. You guessed right. That was our strongest asset. By deciphering the code, we could know all of the German Navy's plans, even the location of their fleet. But now, no wonder you were so confident last time, Charles said with a smug look. However, I believe the world's strongest navy will find a way to solve this, wouldn't I? General Winter could hear the sarcasm in Charles's words, but he didn't care. If it were anyone else, General Winter would have been furious and even willing to fight to the death to uphold his dignity. But this was Charles, and Charles had the right to mock anyone. I'm here to seek cooperation, Charles, General Winter said, staring at Charles with sincerity. Like you said, cooperation between the British and French navies. Charles continued to feign ignorance. Shouldn't you talk to the Secretary of the Navy about this? I already have. General Winter shrugged. He had no objections. But I know that you are more important. Chapter 637 Maritime Reconnaissance Aircraft. Just as the French Navy has long considered the Royal Navy its hypothetical adversary, the Royal Navy has always regarded the French Navy as its rival. Therefore, Admiral Winter was well aware of the relationship between the French Navy Minister and the Brest Fleet. In principle, the French Navy is commanded by the Navy Minister. However, France's unique topography divides its navy into the Brest Fleet, facing the Atlantic in the north, and the Toulon Fleet, facing the Mediterranean in the south. When the Navy Minister first took office, the problem wasn't too serious, but in the last 2 years, he increasingly felt that the French Navy had virtually no hope of catching up with the Royal Navy. He believed that it would be better to focus on developing the Toulon Fleet than to waste funds and resources on the Brest Fleet. The Secretary of the Navy once told everyone in Parliament, it is obvious that no matter how hard we try at the Brest shipyard, we will hardly achieve anything because the powerful British Royal Navy is right across the water, but if we invest our funds and resources in the Toulon shipyard, we can easily control the entire Mediterranean. Even the British Royal Fleet will find it difficult to intervene, so why not? The Secretary of the Navy meant that, if necessary, the French Navy could blockade the Strait of Gibraltar, preventing even the British Royal Navy from passing through, making the French fleet the strongest in this localized area of the Mediterranean. The image above shows the Strait of Gibraltar, which is only 13 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. With this in mind, the Secretary of the Navy began to allocate funds and resources to the Toulon shipyard, even considering abolishing the Brest naval base and relocating everything to Toulon. This was met with resentment and resistance from the Brest naval base and the shipyard, leading to a split within the French Navy between the Brest faction and the Toulon faction. Currently, the actual commanders of the Brest faction are Vice Admiral Gapret, the commander-in-chief, and Wells, the shipyard owner. And Charles is the one who revived the declining Brest shipyard. He was the one who brought a Brest shipyard, which had almost disappeared from public view, back into the global spotlight, even making it a major force capable of controlling supplies and deciding the outcome of the war. You know why, Charles, General Winter said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. He used Charles instead of General. After taking a sip of his coffee, General Winter continued, what we need is not just cooperation, but a plan to blockade the Germans in the North Sea, preventing them from attacking our supply lines. Charles replied expressionlessly, you've done a great job. The Germans are indeed trapped in the harbor and unable to move. That's because we can decipher their codes. General Winter frowned. We all knew things would change. This was another case of offense outweighing defense. A naval offense outweighing defense, the Royal Navy was on the defensive, which inevitably required more manpower. But even with nearly twice the strength of the German Navy, the Royal Navy was still riddled with the weaknesses and unable to defend itself effectively. "Things will change," Charles said calmly. "The addition of the French Navy will compensate for the shortcomings of the Third Fleet. We have nothing to worry about." General Winter shook his head and sighed softly. "Yesterday, the German fleet launched a surprise attack on a part of my Third Fleet. At that time, we even had more warships than the Germans, but we still only damaged 2 of their ships, at the cost of 3 damaged and 2 sunk." He then added, "You know why?" Charles did indeed know why. The Third Fleet was stationed in the narrow English Channel, making it difficult for them to deploy their forces. More importantly, many parts of the channel were mined, which, while preventing the German Navy from passing through, further hampered the Third Fleet's maneuverability. Meanwhile, the German Navy launched its attack from outside the channel, easily forming a perfect T formation against a British fleet. Note, in naval warfare, the key is to utilize speed to form a T formation against the enemy, with one's own ships forming the horizontal line of the T and the enemy's ships forming the vertical line. This way, each of one's own warships can fire simultaneously without obstruction, while only a few enemy warships can fire. "This cannot be compensated for by sheer numbers," said General Winter. "Even if the French Navy joins, it will be patrolling the North Sea as the Fourth Fleet, not crowding into the strait." Charles laughed. "But that's still not enough, is it?" General Winter nodded helplessly. "The North Sea is 965 kilometers long and 643 kilometers wide. The German Navy could attack any point there. How could adding a French fleet be enough? The only solution was to decipher the German codes. But that was now gone forever. The German Navy has seized the initiative, Charles," Admiral Winter said dejectedly. "They use submarines to gather intelligence on our weaknesses, then concentrate their fleet to attack those weaknesses, leaving us defenseless." "Perhaps we have another way," Charles replied calmly. "What?" Admiral Winter looked up at Charles. Was this guy planning to bring the Toulon fleet from France? But Charles's answer surprised him. "Intelligence, General," Charles replied. "Knowing the enemy fleet's movements is the only way to regain the initiative." "But," Admiral Winter looked puzzled, "the Germans have changed their codes. We can no longer obtain accurate intelligence in a timely manner." "There are many ways to obtain intelligence," Charles interrupted Admiral Winter. "You mean, a few months ago, you bought Caproni bombers from me?" Charles looked up at General Winter. "Its purpose isn't just bombing." General Winter was taken aback, then his eyes lit up. "You mean, use the Caproni bombers for reconnaissance missions?" Charles nodded. "A total range of 600 kilometers, and with 2 external fuel tanks, it could potentially reach 1,000 kilometers. That's enough to fly from Britain to Heligoland Bay in Germany and back," Charles added. "Furthermore, it's faster than German seaplanes and comparable to the most advanced German fighter planes. It's arguably the safest reconnaissance aircraft. I don't understand why you don't utilize it." Note, at this time, the German Fokker E-2 had a top speed of 140 km per hour, while the British version of the Caproni, with its unupgraded engine, still had a top speed of 137 km per hour. General Winter's deeply furrowed brows relaxed completely. After considering for a moment, he stood up abruptly and exclaimed, "You're right, Charles, a brilliant idea, unbelievable. We didn't even know we could do that. God, we've always used it as army equipment and never considered using it at sea. We've always used seaplanes as usual." Chapter 638 reminds the Germans. As time went on, the key to victory in naval battles shifted from the warships themselves to air superiority. One reason for this was intelligence. Due to the Earth's curvature, 2 fleets could not detect each other at intervals of approximately 40 kilometers, as the curved seawater obscured their view. The initial solution was for sailors to climb high masts and use telescopes for observation. The higher the position, the farther the view. Next, hot air balloons were equipped on warships for reconnaissance when necessary. Later came seaplanes. Battleships launched seaplanes to expand their reconnaissance range and transmit intelligence back to the fleet. However, once the aircraft phase began, the struggle for air superiority became inevitable. Before either side's seaplanes could even detect the other fleet, aerial combat would commence. Ultimately, the side gaining air superiority possessed information superiority. They could detect the enemy's position, adjust their strategies accordingly, and continuously launch fighters and bombers. The enemy fleet, however, remained oblivious, passively taking hits, not even knowing the enemy fleet's direction. This is the fundamental reason for the rise of modern aircraft carriers and the obsolescence of battleships. The North Sea is a unique area, spanning 643 kilometers east to west. Caproni bombers, equipped with external fuel tanks, could detect most of it. Thus, the entire North Sea was under their wings. Before offering this suggestion, Charles considered a question: if the British, knowing this method, realized they could control the North Sea and block the German Navy, wouldn't they no longer need the French Navy and leave France sidelined? In fact, General Winter's first thought upon learning of this method was indeed this. At this time, Britain had already produced at least 200 Caproni bombers. Although most were fighting on the Western Front, from a national perspective, allocating a few dozen to the Royal Navy wouldn't be a problem. So, did we still need the French Navy? Thinking this, General Winter's eyes darted around, occasionally glancing at Charles. Charles, of course, knew exactly what General Winter was up to. He chuckled and said, "General, I think it's necessary to remind you that reconnaissance by Caproni bombers is not the same as counter-breaking. Counter-breaking directly yields the German operational plan and is unaffected by darkness or weather. Bomber reconnaissance doesn't have these advantages." General Winter thought about it and realized this made sense. Obtaining the entire operational plan directly is not the same as simply knowing the location of the German fleet. More importantly, rain, fog, and darkness would significantly reduce the effectiveness of reconnaissance. Therefore, the cooperation of the French fleet might not be enough. At this moment, General Winter relaxed. He had just been considering what excuse to politely decline the French fleet's participation, but now it seemed completely unnecessary. Then, Charles spread the map out to General Winter, pointing and adding, "Our forces can also participate in reconnaissance missions. Our bombers can take off from Antwerp airfield to scout the waters west of Heligoland Bay." "That's right, Charles, a very good idea," General Winter nodded repeatedly. This would undoubtedly alleviate the severe shortage of bombers in the British forces. General Winter was completely unaware that this was a trap Charles had set for the Royal Navy. Charles's plan to blockade the La Manche Strait wasn't 3 points, but 4. From Brest to the westernmost point to Seine and then to Dunkirk, these 3 points only covered most of the La Manche Strait. The 4th point, and also a crucial strategic point, was Antwerp. Caproni bombers taking off from Antwerp could not only completely blockade the La Manche Strait, but, if necessary, also trap the German Navy in port. More precisely, not just trap them in port, but sink the entire German Navy in port. General Winter assumed it was reconnaissance, unaware that Charles was envisioning a future where improved versions of the Caproni bomber, laden with torpedoes, would be unable to penetrate the English Channel, even for a powerful navy like the British Royal Navy. But this was merely the first hurdle. Charles's true intention was to remind the Germans, they too should develop similar bombers for naval use. In northwestern Germany, on the shores of the North Sea in the Jade Gulf, lies Wilhelmshaven, Germany's most important port. Wilhelmshaven, with its 18-meter depth and the wide, ice-free, silt-free waters of the Jade Gulf, is the main naval port of the German High Seas Fleet. The yellow dot in the image above indicates the location of Wilhelmshaven. Inside the naval command post, the radio crackled incessantly, and documents poured into the hands of Admiral Scheer, the fleet commander. Admiral Scheer looked at the telegrams with a hint of joy. The German High Seas Fleet had achieved some success in several sorties. Although the results were small, it was undoubtedly a good start. If this advantage was maintained, over time, the gap with the British Royal Navy could be closed. "One day, we will break through the British blockade," Admiral Scheer resolved silently. At the same time, he thought to himself, Fluckingham does possess some wisdom, or rather, it was Scheer's wisdom. Fluckingham had merely learned a little from Scheer's tactics. What kind of person was Scheer? Rear Admiral Scheer couldn't help but feel curious about Scheer. His tactics, just a small portion of which was passed on to Fluckingham, had become the German Navy's winning formula. Before this, the German Navy had been plagued by the blockade by the Royal Navy, and no one knew what to do. Just then, a staff officer stepped forward and reported, "General, we've received intelligence that the French Navy has set sail. It's a fleet stationed at Brest Naval Base, and they're entering the English Channel, seemingly to reinforce the North Sea." Admiral Scheer frowned. The French Navy, Colonel Maximilian, a staff officer, analyzed, "General, I don't think the French Navy will change anything. They'll always expose their weaknesses, and this isn't something that can be solved by adding another fleet. Admiral Skier gently shook his head. It's not just the French fleet, Maximilian, but also Charles, and his new invention. Maximilian fell silent. Adding another fleet might not be a big deal, but if Charles were added, along with a bunch of destroyers capable of finding submarines, it would cause significant trouble for the high seas fleet. But this was only the beginning. A moment later, a communications soldier ran up with a telegram, reporting in a panic, "General, the 3rd Task Force has spotted French bombers." Admiral Skier looked at the communications soldier in shock. "They're bombing our warships." "No, General," the communications soldier replied. "They're circling our fleet." Admiral Skier froze, his expression immediately changing. "These bastards, they're using bombers as reconnaissance planes." Chapter 639 Admiral Skier's Bombers. Berlin's Sanssouci Palace. Wilhelm II and Admiral Skier chatted and laughed in the warm drawing room. Wilhelm II seemed quite satisfied with the Navy's performance recently. "It seems our tactics are indeed feasible," Wilhelm II said, flipping through the naval battle briefing with interest. "I think so, Your Majesty," Admiral Skier replied. "As long as we don't rush to break out, but instead focus on inflicting casualties on the British, it's possible in time." "Very good," Wilhelm II nodded, unable to suppress his Gedanke, a complex emotion encompassing both admiration and reflection. "This is a war of the century, General. Germany is facing an unprecedented crisis. If the Navy can ultimately break through the British blockade, do you know what that means?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Admiral Skier replied. "It means we will win this war, not just this war." Wilhelm II's voice grew increasingly impassioned. "The German Navy might even be able to turn the tables and blockade Britain, completely dethroning it from its position as the world's leading power. Then, Germany would be the world's leading power. Britain, having lost all prestige and its naval power weakened, would see its colonies rebel and revolt. Germany could then easily bring these colonies under its control." At this moment, Admiral Skier changed the subject. "Your Majesty, there have been some minor problems, and I need the Chief of the General Staff's assistance." Wilhelm II grunted in agreement. "He'll be here soon. I'll have him fully cooperate with you." Just then, there was a knock at the door, and a guard entered to report, "Your Majesty, the Chief of the General Staff has arrived." "Let him in." Wilhelm II straightened his legs, casually taking a cup from a drawer and placing it in front of the seat to his left. Falkingham pushed open the door and stood before Wilhelm II, saluting sharply. He glanced at Admiral Skier, sitting to Wilhelm II's right, and immediately guessed the purpose of the visit. "I shouldn't have taught him how to deal with the Royal Navy," Falkingham thought. "Now I'm afraid I'll have to pay an even higher price." Wilhelm II gestured for Falkingham to sit down and politely poured him a glass of wine. "You are the backbone of the Empire, gentlemen. We are proud of you. The Army and Navy are both armies of the Empire. Although you are different branches, our goals are the same." Wilhelm II then raised his glass to Falkingham. "Isn't that right, Chief of the General Staff?" "Of course, Your Majesty," Falkingham replied, raising his glass in response. "Everything is for defeating the enemy, for victory, for Germany." "Very good." Wilhelm II turned his gaze to General Scheer, seemingly indicating that he could now make his request. "It is like this, Chief of the General Staff." General Scheer leaned forward and shook Falkingham's hand. "First, I should thank you. Your suggestions last time were very useful to us. We acted based on those suggestions and recently achieved a series of victories." "I know all of this, General," Falkingham interrupted General Scheer. "Let's get to the point. What do you want?" Falkingham's tone was somewhat fiery, seemingly annoyed that he couldn't refuse General Scheer's request. "All right, Chief of the General Staff," Admiral Skier, needing a favor, maintained his composure and demeanor. "I need airplanes," Falkingham inwardly scoffed. He had expected this. It wasn't hard to guess. What else could the Navy need from the Army besides airplanes? Did they want those sailors who couldn't sail? Or tanks? But Falkingham feigned surprise. "Oh? As far as I know, the Navy has its own aircraft, General. Moreover, the Army's aircraft seem unsuitable for sea flight." The image above shows a German naval seaplane from World War I, the Friedrich Schaffner FF-33E. "You're right, Chief of the General Staff," Admiral Skier replied, "but our seaplanes are outdated. They only have a top speed of 100 km per hour and a total range of 400 km, far inferior to the British seaplanes." Wilhelm II interjected. "Yes, The British seaplanes can reach speeds of 120 kilometers per hour, which cause General Skier to lose air superiority in naval battles, and the result of not having air superiority is that the British can use their Caproni bombers to freely spy on our naval areas. You know what that will result in, Chief of the General Staff. The British have a clear grasp of our movements, while we know nothing about them. Falkenhayn frowned. Caproni bombers, yes. Wilhelm I nodded, then, noticing Falkenhayn's odd expression, asked suspiciously, "Is there a problem?" Falkenhayn thought for a moment, then decided it was a good thing, and raised an eyebrow at Admiral Skier, saying, "I'm sorry, I probably can't help you, General. I know this bomber. It's manufactured by Skier's aircraft factory. Currently, none of our fighters can catch it. The latest Fokker E2 is slightly faster, but the difference is negligible. A speed of 140 km per hour versus 137 km per hour is only a 3 km per hour difference per hour. This advantage is far from enough to catch up with and shoot it down in air combat." However, General Skier replied, "I know that, Chief of the General Staff. I learned about it before coming here." Falkenhayn looked puzzled. "So what you want?" "I have an idea, Chief of the General Staff," General Skier answered. Skier's actions gave me a hint. Since they can use bombers as reconnaissance aircraft taking off from the shore, doesn't that mean we can do the same? "You mean, we also use bombers for reconnaissance to gather intelligence on the enemy?" Falkenhayn seemed to understand General Skier's meaning and knew which aircraft General Skier wanted. "Yes," General Skier nodded. "If both sides have intelligence on each other, we won't fall too far behind. It will still be a matter of each side relying on its own abilities," but Falkenhayn shook his head. "Your idea might not be feasible. You know, the British have the Camel fighter. It can shoot down our bombers like an eagle catching a chick. The Camel fighter had a speed of 190 kilometers per hour, it was the king of the skies at that time, and no aircraft could escape its pursuit." "Yes, I know," General Skier replied calmly. "But I think the General Staff also knows that the maximum range of the Camel fighter is only a little over 400 kilometers. The exact figure is 485 kilometers. Falkenhayn was taken aback, thinking to himself that this guy was up to no good. This man had done his homework before coming. It seemed he wouldn't be able to avoid some serious trouble today. Little did Falkenhayn know that General Skier had already discussed things with the pilots for hours beforehand, and had even sent people to gather intelligence from the Air Force, possessing a considerable amount of data and even knowledge of air combat. Chapter 640. Charles helped us. Admiral Skier, who had done his homework thoroughly, appeared very confident. He took a nautical chart from his jacket pocket, spread it out on the coffee table, and analyzed. Fighters are different from bombers. The combat radius of a fighter jet is usually 1/3 of its total range, 1/3 of the fuel is used to reach the target battlefield, 1/3 is used to pursue and shoot down the target, and the remaining 1/3 is used for the return trip. Therefore, although the Camel fighter jet is invincible, its combat radius is only a little over 100 kilometers, which is its biggest weakness. As he spoke, Admiral Skier looked up at Falkenhayn, his eyes filled with questioning and a hint of provocation. Falkenhayn could only nod, replying in a muffled voice, "Yes, you're right." General Skier, a smug smile playing on his lips, continued his analysis. "First of all, the British Camel fighters haven't even entered mass production yet. They only have a handful, a few dozen, and the vast majority are deployed to the Western Front. Even if they were mass-produced, they could only control about 100 kilometers of sea off the British coast. Our bombers, however, can use binoculars to reconnoiter along that line, covering almost the entire North Sea." Wilhelm I exclaimed in surprise. "The entire North Sea?" "Yes," Admiral Skier nodded. "This is very advantageous to us. Sometimes I think that while Skier's actions appear to be helping the British, they are actually helping us." "What?" Wilhelm I and Falkenhayn simultaneously cast questioning glances at Admiral Skier. How could Skier possibly help the German Navy? Admiral Skier explained to the map. The British blockade stretches from the north of the North Sea all the way to the south, with numerous escort fleets and merchant ships in between. This line is nearly 1,000 kilometers long. If they are all under the reconnaissance of our bombers. Hearing this, Wilhelm I and Falkenhayn understood, nodding thoughtfully. "That's right," Wilhelm I said. "The longer the defensive line, the more weaknesses it has, and the more opportunities we can find to attack." Falkenhayn added, "And our army, already trapped in Heligoland Bay by the British fleet, has very few weaknesses or loopholes in our defensive line. You could even say there are none." No loopholes. Wilhelm I looked at Buckingham in astonishment, not understanding why there were no loopholes. But Admiral Skier nodded in agreement. The Royal Navy is unlikely to change its long-range blockade strategy, so we have no loopholes, no weaknesses. Wilhelm I paused, then understood. Even if the British discovered a loophole in the German defensive line, so what? Send a fleet to attack? Impossible. Because that would mean the Royal Navy would have to abandon its long-range blockade strategy and instead launch a proactive attack on Heligoland Bay. They would then face a massive number of German torpedo boats and even coastal artillery in coastal waters, which was clearly unwise and exactly what the German fleet wanted. Therefore, the German fleet's defenses had no weaknesses. However, Wilhelm I soon frowned again. Even if our fleet discovers the British weaknesses, we cannot attack them. I mean, if the British use enough Caproni bombers for reconnaissance, they can accurately track our fleet's movements. Once our warships leave Heligoland Bay, they will be immediately tracked by their bombers. Admiral Skier calmly replied, Your Majesty, the weakness of aerial reconnaissance is that nighttime missions are difficult, even dangerous. Dangerous? Wilhelm I looked bewildered. He understood the difficulties. It was hard to spot targets at night, but the danger. Buckingham agreed again. Yes, especially over the sea. If there are no stars or moonlight, and it's pitch black all around, the pilot can't even tell which way is the sky and which way is the sea. He might plunge headfirst into the ocean thinking he's ascending. Wilhelm I seemed to understand, but not quite. Having never flown, he didn't know the feeling of weightlessness and therefore couldn't comprehend the pilot mistaking the sea for the sky. However, he didn't ask further. Since both Buckingham and Admiral Skier had said so, they must be right. Wilhelm I knew the outcome. So, our warships can operate at night. Yes, Admiral Skier answered confidently. Once we find a British weakness, we can send out a fast fleet to attack at night. As long as we reach the target position before dawn, launch the attack, and then immediately retreat, the British won't be able to do anything to us. The German fleet's light cruisers had a speed of 27 knots, and the destroyers had 29 knots. Based on the speed of a light cruiser, it could travel 48 kilometers per hour, making it not impossible to reach the target location from Heligoland overnight. We have many targets, Admiral Skier said, a flicker of excitement in his eyes. Not just the British Third Fleet, but also the British convoy. With submarines and aerial reconnaissance to gather precise intelligence, our fast fleet can bypass their patrol fleets and strike their merchant ships directly. Wilhelm I's face lit up with delight. You mean, we don't even need submarines? Yes, Admiral Skier nodded confidently. We could potentially achieve greater results at a lower cost, and even capture some supplies, if time allows. Excellent. Wilhelm I rubbed his hands excitedly. Only Buckingham remained silent, frowning. After a while, he hesitated and said, But why would Charles do this? I mean, didn't he think of these things? Buckingham had been fooled several times before. He believed Charles wasn't as simple as Admiral Skier thought. But Admiral Skier didn't hesitate at all. I think it's because Skier didn't consider that we have bombers, or rather, he simply didn't know we had bombers. As he spoke, Admiral Skier's eyes were fixed on Buckingham, awaiting his reply. Buckingham nodded slightly. Yes, this is the bomber we developed last year, designed to compete with Skier's Caproni. No one except our high command knows about it. The image above shows the German Gotha G-1 bomber. The first was produced in July 1915, with only 20 ever made. That's right, Wilhelm I said excitedly. Skier didn't know we had bombers, so he was unprepared. He didn't even realize he had made an irreparable mistake. At this moment, Wilhelm I didn't know that this was actually Skier's intention to let them know. From the perspective of the French Navy, Skier didn't want to see the German Navy trapped in Heligoland Bay, unable to move. Therefore, his goal was to help the German Navy, allowing them to fight a proper battle against the British Royal Navy. Ideally, it would be a scene of utter chaos, with dark skies, bitter winds, and unbearable devastation. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 641 at Seaplane. In mid-February in Germany, the weather warmed and the snow melted. The North Sea had recently experienced a severe storm, with waves reaching over 10 meters high, sweeping through coastal villages and burying all crops under thick layers of sand and silt. Numerous houses were destroyed, leaving many civilians homeless and forced to beg for survival. This exacerbated Germany's already severe shortages, and signs of riots emerged in some areas. Admiral Scheer had no time to concern himself with these matters. Standing on the observation deck in Wilhelmshaven, his eyes were fixed on an aircraft being towed out of the harbor by a tugboat. It was a large seaplane converted from a Gotha G-1 bomber, which Admiral Scheer named Oat. The image above shows the German Oat seaplane, converted from a Gotha G-1 bomber. The reason for the conversion was that Admiral Scheer believed the Gotha bomber's performance was still insufficient to meet the Navy's needs. Its speed was similar to that of Charles's Caproni bomber, reaching 135 kilometers per hour, but its total range was only 520 kilometers, and even with external fuel tanks, it could only reach 800 kilometers. This might allow the Gotha bomber to fly to the northern North Sea, but it could only make a brief appearance before having to return, otherwise it would never return due to insufficient fuel. This short reconnaissance time might not even allow it to spot the main British fleet. "This is not what we want," Admiral Scheer said worriedly to his staff. "Our goal is to break out, which requires us to keep abreast of the movements of the main Royal Navy fleet. But right now, the bombers we have simply cannot do that." Admiral Scheer received 6 Gotha G-1s from Fockingham, and although Fockingham promised to accelerate production to maintain supply, this was far from enough. Staff Officer Maximilian analyzed, "The problem is that these planes have to return to the airport to refuel every time they go out for reconnaissance, thus wasting a lot of time and fuel on ineffective flights." "You mean," Admiral Scheer looked at Maximilian, then he understood, "you mean to convert them into seaplanes?" "Yes," Maximilian nodded. "Once converted into seaplanes, they won't need to return to refuel. We can set up several resupply points at sea and have submarines carry fuel to resupply these planes." Admiral Scheer nodded in agreement. "This can even make up for the Gotha's short range and further expand our reconnaissance range." So, Admiral Scheer took advantage of the treacherous sea conditions and rough seas in the North Sea during January and February to urgently upgrade the Gotha bombers, converting them into seaplanes. The staff officer's report brought Admiral Scheer back to reality. "General, everything is ready." Admiral Scheer then noticed that the Oat seaplanes were already parked at sea, tugboats made way, and patrol boats cleared a runway several hundred meters ahead. General Scheer nodded slightly and ordered in a deep voice, "Begin." As the communications officer signaled, the seaplane's engines roared, like a monster howling across the sea. The 2 propellers beneath the fuselage spun rapidly, faster and faster, soon becoming a blur. The seawater below rippled in the strong wind. Then, the plane slowly moved forward, its floats pushing against the waves with difficulty, the resistance seemingly increasing, the waves rising higher and higher. The speed increased, and finally, to everyone's anticipation, the bomber broke free from the sea's grasp and took off. The officers and soldiers below spontaneously cheered, some even clapping in celebration. General Scheer breathed a sigh of relief, nodded with satisfaction, and ordered Maximilian, "You're in charge of their reconnaissance, Colonel. We must find the enemy's weaknesses as quickly as possible and launch an attack." Germany desperately needed victory at this time, at least to give people hope, even if it was just a glimmer. Otherwise, the starving people would overthrow the Emperor's rule. Scheer was currently in Antwerp. With Hasselt's successful incursion and the capture of 200,000 German troops, Antwerp had become a second line of defense. More accurately, not a second line, but the rear, a vast rear area over 60 kilometers from the front. The main British forces had been redeployed, including Lieutenant General Avis, to the Somme. The British stubbornly believed this was worthwhile and hoped for a remarkable victory there. This approach was more like a gamble. Kitchener didn't want to suffer so many losses for nothing, or he believed the Germans on the other side were on the verge of collapse, and that a little more British effort would be enough to crush the enemy and achieve a glorious victory. So they continuously poured men, supplies, and ammunition into the Somme. However, the Germans on the other side were also pouring men, supplies, and ammunition into the same way. But the reality was that the defensive line slowly pushed back and forth, with only supplies and soldiers dwindling. Charles still kept his command post at the airfield. Unlike before, the airfield now had 12 Caproni bombers, modified versions capable of carrying torpedoes. Director Dorn of the Aircraft Development Department personally led the team responsible for the logistics and technical guidance of this batch of bombers. Holding a diagram, Dorn told Charles, based on our testing, the speed before dropping the torpedo should ideally not exceed 100 kilometers per hour. Furthermore, the aircraft must maintain a stable attitude, otherwise, the torpedo will tumble in the air due to inertia, making it impossible to launch in the correct direction. The altitude should ideally be maintained at around 20 meters, Charles sighed inwardly. Speed, attitude, and altitude, there were indeed requirements, seemingly even more stringent. Note, during World War II, torpedo attack aircraft were mostly required to be 10 to 30 meters high. However, this wasn't surprising. The industrial level of World War I was always different from that of World War II. The necessary steps still had to be taken. It wasn't something that could be easily solved simply by anticipating it in advance, especially with only a little over a month for development. This places high demands on the pilots, Dorn reminded him. These are large bombers, attacking enemy warships. Even pulling up in time after dropping the bombs will be difficult. Charles hummed in agreement. Charles wasn't worried about this. After so many air battles, the Air Regiment had trained a large number of experienced pilots. Furthermore, although the Caproni was a large bomber, its speed remained around 100 kilometers per hour, giving the pilot over a minute's reaction time to drop torpedoes from a distance of 2 kilometers, enough time for the pilot to pull up. The problem was that pilots might try to drop the torpedoes as close as possible to increase their chances of success. Those adventurous types, always eager to push their limits and celebrate their success in the sky, included even the Air Corps commander, Carter. Just as Charles and Dorn were discussing the details, a guard approached and reported, "General, Lieutenant General Geppetto has arrived and wishes to speak with you." Chapter 642 We can't be faster than the Germans. Vice Admiral Gapret was the commander of the French Northern Fleet. He was a typical Brest faction member, the group that considered the British Royal Navy its adversary and refused to be outdone. But in reality, Vice Admiral Gapret was merely unwilling to accept defeat. He occasionally confided to his subordinates, "Everything we do may just be like a fish helplessly struggling in a net." Ultimately finding that nothing can be changed, his subordinates understood. The gap between the French Navy and the British Royal Navy was too great, so great that it was likely beyond human or individual will to change. They had to accept this reality. Like in the Dardanelles, France and Britain were both allied powers and equal allies, yet naturally the British Royal Navy commanded the French fleet, and no one even voiced any objection. Now would be no exception, Vice Admiral Gapret thought. At most, they would become a British auxiliary fleet in the North Sea, only able to escort convoys, not engage in combat. With a heavy heart, Vice Admiral Gapret stepped into Charles's command post. "Welcome, General," Charles greeted Lieutenant General Gapret with a handshake. "How have you been lately?" "Very well," Lieutenant General Gapret nodded. "Perhaps due to the storm, the Germans have been relatively quiet this month. Even their submarines have rarely been deployed." "That's good news." Charles stepped aside and led Lieutenant General Gapret into the conference room. A servant immediately brought them both a cup of coffee, along with some cake and freshly cut apples. Since the French fleet joined the war with its echo detectors, the supply situation had improved, especially at the supply port of Antwerp. Lieutenant General Gapret sat down, casually took a few sips of his coffee, and said as he put down the cup, "However, some new developments have emerged these past few days, and I think you might need to know about them." "Oh," Charles replied, "you mean, the Germans have appeared in the North Sea with their new seaplanes?" "You know," Lieutenant General Gapret looked somewhat surprised, but a second later he understood. "Yes, of course you know. You have aircraft conducting aerial reconnaissance of the Germans." "Yes, General," Charles nodded. "You should shoot them down." Lieutenant General Geplet stared at Charles. "Those guys are dangerous. With them in the air, they know exactly how many warships and merchant ships we have, and where they are. If they want, they can organize a fleet stronger than ours to launch a surprise attack at any time." "I know," Charles said helplessly, "but we can't." Before Lieutenant General Geplet could ask, Charles explained, "Our fighters can't fly that far, and our bombers are about as fast as theirs. 137 kilometers per hour is almost the same as 135 kilometers per hour, neither can catch the other. If the other side wants, they can simply maintain a straight line at maximum speed to keep the distance. They don't even need to maneuver to avoid it." Lieutenant General Geplet looked at him with a strange expression. "But that's the British Caproni, not ours. I heard you've replaced the engines on our Caproni, so they must be faster." "Right, that's just a rumor," Charles said hesitantly. "I did have that idea, and even put it into practice. But after replacing the engines with more powerful ones, I discovered a series of problems, including structural instability and loss of flight control. Of course, that wasn't the case. The new Caproni had a top speed of 160 kilometers per hour. As long as it wasn't armed with torpedoes and machine guns, chasing down German U-boat bombers was no problem at all. Lieutenant General Jeplet looked at Charles with a skeptical expression. Is that so? That's a pity, Charles smiled, saying meaningfully, we can't be faster than the Germans, General. Can't. Lieutenant General Jeplet looked at Charles, seemingly understanding the implication. Yes, we can't, Charles nodded. Otherwise, you know what will happen. Lieutenant General Jeplet was taken aback, then understood. Once the new Caproni is deployed, the Germans' pitifully few seaplanes will be wiped out immediately. Then, the British will pose no further threat. But, Vice Admiral Gapreth said worriedly, we are also part of the escort force. Our fleet is also patrolling the North Sea. They are in danger too. Yes, I know, Charles said confidently. We might even become the Germans' primary target, or rather, their prime target. How so? Vice Admiral Gapreth asked, startled. It's simple, Charles analyzed. In the Germans' eyes, the Royal Navy is definitely stronger than the French fleet, and the French Navy also poses a significant threat to their submarines. Vice Admiral Gapreth instantly understood. The French fleet was the weak point of the North Sea defenses because it lacked combat experience, its tactics were outdated, and its warships were inferior to the British. From the Germans' perspective, it was naturally best to pick on the weakest link and cripple the French fleet first. Lieutenant General Gapreth frowned, but you knew the French fleet would be the Germans' target, yet you still let their seaplanes run rampant. Shouldn't we eliminate the German seaplanes immediately? Charles didn't speak, but stood up and gestured for him to enter. I'll show you something, General. Inside the enclosed hangar at Antwerp Airport, Carter and several pilots were studying attack tactics with a Caproni bomber. Simply meeting the requirements for launching the torpedo is far from enough, Carter said to the pilots. Have you considered that the optimal angle for a torpedo to successfully hit its target and sink it is a vertical strike? Yes, Colonel. So, Carter said, holding a model airplane and pointing it at a wrench on the ground, we should fly the plane in circles to lower our altitude and then cut in at a vertical angle, while also estimating the warship's speed and taking full lead. At that moment, Charles appeared at the hangar door, and Carter quickly led his men to greet him and salute. This is Lieutenant General Gapreth, Charles introduced. I think you know him. Yes, General. Carter and his men stood up and saluted Lieutenant General Gapreth, shaking his hand warmly. Lieutenant General Gapreth glanced at Charles with a puzzled look, wondering why Charles had brought him here to meet this group of pilots. Suddenly, he stared blankly at the plane parked in the hangar, speechless with shock for a long time. God, those are torpedoes? The planes weren't carrying bombs, but torpedoes? Chapter 643. Something just as dangerous. In the waters south of the North Sea, the sun slowly rose from the east, but instead of its usual golden brilliance, it was obscured by thick fog, appearing only as a blurry fireball. A fleet moved slowly through the fog like ghosts, its hulls rocking rhythmically, crashing against the waves with heavy thuds, like groans or the pounding of a heart, repeating endlessly. Leading the fleet was a battle cruiser, its 8 305mm main guns ready and waiting. The gunners were at their positions, nervously scanning their surroundings, awaiting orders. The towering gun barrels pointed skyward, occasionally adjusting their aim, seemingly poised to unleash a furious roar at the enemy. This was the German High Seas Fleet's battlecruiser Lutzow, the flagship of the First Fast Fleet, widely recognized as the fastest, newest, and most advanced battlecruiser. The image above shows the battlecruiser Lutzow, commissioned on August 8, 1915, the second ship of the Deflinger-class battlecruisers. In the captain's cabin, Rear Admiral von Kavis, after finishing breakfast, as usual took out his diary from the drawer, opened it to a blank page, and casually scribbled on it in cursive script, February 25th. I don't know what to say about the weather, it's like fog, yet also like a light drizzle. That's how the North Sea is, overcast 270 out of 365 days, and half the time shrouded in fog. But I think this is advantageous to us, because the British reconnaissance planes can't see us, at least not until the fog clears. And the French. They are our target for this operation. We've detected a convoy passing nearby, escorted by 15 destroyers and 2 cruisers from the French fleet. Hopefully, they won't discover us too early and choose to flee. Especially those destroyers, they can spot our submarines. Suddenly, a staff officer pushed open the door and reported, "General, the fog has cleared." Cavis grunted, closed his notebook, put away his pen, and muttered to himself, "From now on, let's write a battle report." Without hesitation, he rose, let his staff officer out, and quickly walked up the gangway to the command tower. Rear Admiral Cavis remained as steady as a rock amidst the swaying ship. He glanced around. The fog was indeed dissipating, visibility was increasing, and rays of sunlight, like sharp swords, pierced through the clouds and shone on the sea, creating shimmering, fish-scale-like patterns. "Full speed ahead," Cavis ordered. Cavis always made sure his fleet reached maximum speed before the battle began. "Full speed ahead, full speed ahead." The orders were relayed. The fleet sped up, thick smoke billowing from the warship's smokestacks, occasionally punctuated by sparks. The communications officer used signal lights to continuously inform the ships behind to keep up. This was a fleet of 20 warships, including the battlecruiser Lutzow, the Mooch, and the Sedley. The latter two were Mooch-class battlecruisers. Because their speed was similar to that of the Lutzow, they were assigned to the first fast fleet for quick strikes and withdrawals. In addition, there were 2 cruisers and 15 destroyers. Rear Admiral Carvis firmly believed that this force could quickly defeat the French fleet. If time allowed, Rear Admiral Carvis also hoped to capture a number of merchant ships and escort them back to Germany. Germany desperately needed these supplies, daily necessities and gasoline, and unused munitions should be destroyed or sunk on the spot. "Launch the seaplanes," Rear Admiral Carvis ordered in a deep voice. "Launch the seaplanes, launch the seaplanes." Seaplanes could expand the reconnaissance range, allowing the fleet to pinpoint the exact location of the target. However, Rear Admiral Carvis soon realized this was unnecessary. 10 minutes later, the lookout on the mast shouted, "Target spotted." Rear Admiral Carvis raised his binoculars and looked in the indicated direction. Sure enough, he saw a blurry shadow in the still lingering fog. "Prepare for battle," Rear Admiral Carvis decisively ordered. "Change to column formation to engage." Note, a long, straight-eye formation is more convenient for fleet navigation. In engagement, one should strive to deploy firepower in a straight line. The fleet deployed smoothly. The faster destroyers and cruisers at the rear caught up quickly and spread out on both sides, forming a column with 3 battlecruisers at its core, charging towards the enemy. The target drew closer. Rear Admiral Carvis could see the target's hull in his binoculars. At the same time, the guns were loaded and aimed at the target, waiting only for his order to unleash a torrent of fire on the enemy ships. But then, a communications officer reported, "General, enemy fleet has appeared on the flank." Rear Admiral Carvis understood instantly. The French fleet used merchant ships as bait, while its main force circled around to the flanks of the main fleet under the cover of fog. "Change formation," Rear Admiral Carvis shouted. But it was too late. The cannon fire erupted the moment Carvis gave the order. The whistling sound grew louder as it approached, sending plumes of water soaring into the sky around the fleet. Ships rocked violently on the turbulent sea, and several shells struck, exploding in flashes of fire and smoke. The Lutzow was also hit by a shell, but it failed to penetrate its 300 mm thick side armor, only causing a barely perceptible sway. Rear Admiral Carvis glanced at the flames from the shell's impact on the ship, a cold smile playing on his lips. This was the difference in strength. The reason the battle-hardened Rear Admiral Carvis had fallen into this trap was because he hadn't expected the escort fleet, consisting only of cruisers and destroyers, to dare to challenge them head-on. These fools should have chosen to flee, or wait for the main fleet to arrive before rejoining the battle. Attacking now would only bring destruction. Boom, 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 boom. The main guns of the Lutzow opened fire. Rear Admiral Carvis raised his binoculars amidst the violent shaking. The first salvo was spreading across the enemy cruiser, a good start. Note, spreading refers to the simultaneous distribution of water columns from the salvo in front of and behind the target ship during a bombardment. This indicates highly accurate firing data, and continued adjustments based on these data would likely result in a high probability of hitting the target. Suddenly, a dark shadow swept overhead. Rear Admiral Carvis initially dismissed it. It was a Charles Caproni bomber. Rear Admiral Carvis thought, "It's just a reconnaissance aircraft, let it watch how we sink our targets one by one." But the moment the Caproni bomber disappeared from view, Rear Admiral Carvis felt a sharp pain, as if stabbed by something. He couldn't see what it was, but his subconscious told him it was something dangerous. Chapter 644 Air-Launched Torpedo. Rear Admiral Carvis hurriedly raised his binoculars to follow the circling bomber, but it had already disappeared into the fog like a nimble seagull. With a bad feeling, Rear Admiral Carvis ordered, "Watch out for the bombers in the sky. Shoot them down with machine guns." "Yes, General," the staff officer responded and relayed the order, but he was still puzzled. Reconnaissance planes were used to locate enemy fleets. Once the enemy fleet was located, the reconnaissance planes were no longer effective. Was it wise to divert attention to dealing with those reconnaissance planes now? Boom! A loud explosion. Rear Admiral Carvis noticed a cruiser on his flank erupt with a plume of water. The next second, its hull lost balance, circling in place before crashing helplessly to the rear. "General," the staff officer reported, "it's the Destined. It's been hit by a torpedo." "A torpedo?" Rear Admiral Carvis raised his binoculars and looked at the distant French fleet. "The enemy is at least 3 kilometers away. How could they launch a torpedo at this distance?" At this time, most torpedoes had a range of less than 2 kilometers, and even torpedoes with a range of 3 kilometers were almost impossible to hit their targets at this distance. Note, at this time, most torpedoes' speeds were below 40 knots, and their low speed would create a waterline on the sea surface, giving ships time to evade, but soon, the communications officer's response confirmed this. "General," the communications officer reported, "the Destined reports that the torpedo was launched from an enemy ship." The Destined took emergency evasive action, but the enemy torpedo changed direction at the last moment and hit the ship. "What?" Rear Admiral Carvis's expression changed drastically. "The torpedo changed direction," the staff officer analyzed. "General, this could be a coincidence. The waves changed the torpedo's direction and happened to hit the Destined." Rear Admiral Carvis nodded slightly. This was the only explanation. Otherwise, could it have been a wire-guided torpedo? If that were the case, it would be terrifying. But soon another destroyer was hit by a torpedo. Even more bizarrely, the destroyer's report was exactly the same as the Destined's. 2 torpedoes attacked simultaneously. "We evaded one, but the other changed direction and hit the hull." Rear Admiral Carvis's face turned ashen. If it were just one warship, it could be considered a coincidence, but if 2 warships were hit like this, and one of them was a G-101 class destroyer with a top speed of 33.5 knots, the image above shows a German G-101 class destroyer. The speed of this type of destroyer was even comparable to that of the torpedo, yet it couldn't evade the torpedo attack? No, this was no coincidence. This was very likely Charles's invention, a torpedo that could change direction in time to track enemy warships, a wire-guided torpedo. At this moment, Rear Admiral Carvis finally understood why the French fleet dared to confront a fleet of 3 German battlecruisers with just cruisers and destroyers. It wasn't them who should be fleeing, but us. However, what shocked Rear Admiral Carvis even more was what happened next. 2 bombers circled back to the sun, then descended, cutting into the port side of the battlecruiser Sedlife at a near-perfect arc. Rear Admiral Carvis raised his binoculars and froze, speechless for a moment. Those 2 bombers were carrying torpedoes under their fuselages. They were indeed torpedoes, he wasn't mistaken. "Order the Sedlife to take emergency evasive action," Rear Admiral Carvis practically shouted the order. But it was too late. The 2 bombers descended one after the other to an altitude of about 20 meters, then steadily approached the Sedlife. The Sedlife seemed to sense the danger and changed course. But the bombers only jettisoned their torpedoes when they were about a kilometer away, then rapidly climbed, their fuselages almost touching the battlecruiser's mast. Rear Admiral Carvis even saw the flag on the mast being blown backward by the strong wind from the planes. Rear Admiral Carvis immediately turned his attention to the sea, where 2 white streaks of water were rapidly approaching the Sedlife, like 2 sharks charging at their prey. Torpedoes! Only then did the sailors realize the danger, exclaiming, "God, am I seeing things? They're using airplanes to launch torpedoes." The Sedlife hard turned to starboard to evade, and some quick reacting sailors fired their rifles at the torpedoes. But their reaction time was too short. A minute later, 2 loud booms were heard, and the Sedlife was paralyzed in place amidst the 2 columns of water. Soon after, its hull began to list and even capsize. The sailors didn't even have time to lower the lifeboats, they jumped overboard amidst screams and shouts to escape. The sailors on the other warships were stunned by this scene, finally realizing a harsh reality. The enemy could sink their battleships with airplanes, and their battleships didn't even have decent anti-aircraft weapons. "General," The staff officer looked at Rear Admiral Carvis, fear in his eyes. Rear Admiral Carvis understood what this meant. Retreat was now necessary, or the entire fleet would be annihilated. Rear Admiral Carvis didn't speak. He expressionlessly glanced at the sky, then walked to the other side to observe for a while before saying in a low voice, "They still have 4 bombers left. I noticed each bomber can only carry 1 torpedo." This meant the French only had 4 torpedoes left, so there was still a chance to win. But the staff officer cautioned, "General, this might only be one of their squadrons." The implication was that the other squadron might be on its way or out of the warship's sights. Rear Admiral Carvis gritted his teeth. "Order all units to be on guard against torpedoes dropped by enemy bombers." "Yes, General," the staff officer reluctantly relayed Rear Admiral Carvis's order. Rear Admiral Carvis wasn't unaware of the danger. He knew it was time to retreat. He ordered the fighting to continue because he considered another problem. If French bombers could carry torpedoes to attack warships, did that mean the British Caproni bombers could too? Furthermore, did the Royal Navy possess torpedoes with a range of 3 kilometers and the ability to change direction? If the answer was yes, where could the German High Seas Fleet escape to? To rot forever in port? No, absolutely not. I would rather die here than stay in port until my last breath. Just then, 2 more bombers descended to low altitude. This time, their target was clearly the Lutzow. "Hard port," Rear Admiral Carvis ordered. But the planes were too fast. In the blink of an eye, they released 2 torpedoes, creating 2 terrifying waterlines. They even managed to anticipate the attack, precisely approaching the Lutzow. Chapter 645, he was extremely worried about the German Navy. Ultimately, the German First Fast Fleet suffered a crushing defeat, losing 1 battle cruiser, 2 cruisers, and 4 destroyers. The battleship Lutzow managed to return safely. It survived only because a cruiser intercepted a torpedo at the last moment. Afterwards, Rear Admiral Carvis was forced to order a fleet retreat, realizing it was pointless. They had come with 20 ships, eager to intimidate the French Navy, but returned with only 13, having damaged only 2 destroyers and 1 cruiser. This infuriated Rear Admiral Carvis. Most seriously, the Germans lost a valuable battle cruiser, the Moltke-class Sedlife, a remarkably advanced battle cruiser, commissioned in May 1913, less than 3 years prior. Antwerp, Charles's command post. When news of the victory arrived, cheers erupted in the command post. The staff officers excitedly rushed to Charles, surrounding him and vying to hug and shake his hand. "Fantastic, General! We defeated the German Navy, unbelievable! We suffered almost no losses, yet sank a battle cruiser, the Germans' most advanced battle cruiser. The German fleet is second in the world. If we defeated them, does that mean our Navy is second in the world now?" The speaker was Wei Gang, who, as the operations staff officer, had always been by Charles's side. The staff officers all turned their gazes to Wei Gang, their eyes filled with a hint of mockery. Second in the world? Did this guy think the French Navy would still be satisfied with being second in the world at this level? However, they all tacitly understood and didn't say it aloud, only smiling knowingly. At this moment, Lieutenant General Grapert entered Charles's office. His command post was downstairs from Charles's, which was to facilitate coordination between the Air Force and Navy. Otherwise, this battle couldn't have been fought so brilliantly. Vice Admiral Gayplatz, his face flushed with excitement, stepped forward and grasped Charles's hand, trembling as he said, "We've won. We've really won, Vice Admiral. You were right, those torpedo bombers were really effective." "Of course, General," Charles replied calmly. "Actually, even without the torpedo bombers, the Germans wouldn't have fared well in this battle." Vice Admiral Gayplatz nodded heavily. Although the escort fleet was inferior to the German fleet in both tonnage and firepower, the French fleet used merchant ships as bait to occupy advantageous T-shaped positions, allowing them to open fire on the German fleet from the outset. More importantly, the French fleet used the fog to approach the German fleet, entering torpedo range of 3 kilometers at the start of the battle. At this distance, the French fleet, equipped with new wire-guided torpedoes, was capable of fighting even against heavily armed battle cruisers. "I have some questions to discuss with you." Vice Admiral Gayplatz glanced towards the conference room. Charles understood, rose, and followed Vice Admiral Gayplatz into the conference room, closing the door behind them. Cheers erupted again from outside the door, some men frantically hurling documents and papers into the air, which danced like petals welcoming a hero. Lieutenant General Gaplet sat in his chair, nodding with satisfaction, his eyes filled with emotion, soon welling with tears. He recalled the French Navy's struggles over the past century. They had always tried so hard, yet were consistently outmatched by the British Royal Navy. Until now they had even been reduced to withdrawing from the Atlantic and defending only the Mediterranean. Now, everything seemed different. "General," Charles called out. Lieutenant General Gaplet jolted awake, a slightly embarrassed smile on his face as he sniffed and secretly wiped his eyes. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant General, you understand, this is a special victory, very special." "Yes, I understand," Charles nodded in understanding. This was of great significance to the Navy, especially for veterans like Gaplet. They had the prospect of witnessing the French Navy return to its peak in their lifetime, and that alone would leave them with no regrets, not to mention the enormous benefits it would bring to France afterward. After taking some time to calm himself, Vice Admiral Gaplet said slowly, "Although we have achieved a remarkable victory this time, it seems to be strategically disadvantageous, am I right?" Charles nodded. He knew what Vice Admiral Gaplet was referring to. France's ultimate goal was to surpass the Royal Navy, even without direct combat, to let the British and the world know that the world's leading navy was France, not Britain. From this strategic perspective, France should unite with the German Navy to contain the Royal Navy. Therefore, inflicting heavy damage on the German Navy was not in France's interest. "I know," Charles said, "which is why we didn't pursue them with all our might." At this time, the French Navy was equipped with 1,000-ton Adventurer-class destroyers, with a top speed of 31 knots, which wouldn't be a problem for them to catch up with the German fleet. Only one squadron of bombers was deployed, the other squadron circled nearby without engaging in combat. "But we still sank 7 German warships, including a battle cruiser," Vice Admiral Gaplet said with concern. "I fear the German fleet will never dare to leave Heligoland Bay again." Charles shook his head, his eyes full of confidence. "No, General, they will come out. They will soon know the British don't have our new torpedoes or torpedo bombers. Even if they have the Caproni, the purpose of this battle is to send a message to the Germans. Don't mess with the French Navy again." Gaplet nodded slightly. France had torpedo-carrying bombers in the sky, new wire-guided torpedoes in the sea, and echolocation devices to find submarines. The Germans knew how to choose. Then Charles added, "If the Germans are smart enough, they should realize this is the key to breaking the British Royal Navy's blockade, which would be a blessing in disguise for them." "What?" Vice Admiral Gaplet was taken aback. "You mean, the Germans can break the British fleet's blockade?" "Of course," Charles reminded him. "The Germans have more advanced aircraft engines. They've just mistakenly used their most advanced engines on airships." Vice Admiral Gaplet was confused, and after a moment's thought, he said, "Oh, they can improve the performance of their bombers and carry torpedoes." "Yes, General," Charles replied. "The Germans can't surpass the British on battleships. I can only help them elevate the war to another level." Vice Admiral Gaplet stared blankly at Charles for a long time, unable to speak. So this was Charles's true purpose. He was truly worried sick about the German Navy. Chapter 646, A Glimmer of Hope. In Wilhelmshaven, Germany, Admiral Skier anxiously awaited news of victory. Victory should be assured, he asked himself repeatedly. Accurate intelligence, coupled with the presence of 3 battle cruisers, should make victory a certainty. Yet, for some reason, Admiral Skier remained restless and uneasy. After much deliberation, he concluded he had found the reason. The opponent was Charles. Charles was based in Antwerp, directing reconnaissance with his air wing, and the French Navy might also be operating under his command, or rather, on his advice. Admiral Skier could disregard all of Charles's land victories, including the incursions into Antwerp and Hasselt. Those were land victories, entirely different from naval battles. However, Admiral Skier could not ignore Charles's victories in the Dardanelles, such as his development of landing craft, amphibious assault ships, depth charges, and especially equipment capable of detecting submarines. Would Charles have new equipment for this battle? No, that was unlikely. Naval equipment differs from army equipment, it cannot be developed overnight, and its tactics are largely stable, unlikely to undergo significant changes. Admiral Skier envisioned naval tactics as big guns and giant ships, believing future tactical development would involve dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts, essentially piling on armor and cannons. What Admiral Skier didn't anticipate was that naval tactics would soon undergo a radical transformation, even reaching another dimension. In the communications room, a communications soldier received a telegram amidst the beeping of beeps. He immediately operated the cipher machine to translate it, and with a series of clicks, the message quickly appeared. The communications soldier glanced at the telegram, his face instantly draining of color, but he still immediately rose and delivered the telegram to Admiral Skier. General, the communications soldier swallowed hard, hesitant to even report. Admiral Skier had a bad feeling. He rushed forward, snatched the telegram, and stared blankly. He had considered failure, but never imagined it would be so devastating. 7 warships were lost, including a battle cruiser, with no achievements to speak of, only 3 enemy ships damaged. After a while, Admiral Skier looked up at the communications officer and demanded, "Find out the cause. What led to this?" "Yes, General." Before the words were even finished, another communications officer delivered a second telegram. The French possess new torpedoes with a longer range, at least 3 kilometers. They are likely wire-guided torpedoes. More importantly, they are mounting torpedoes on bombers to attack warships. Admiral Skier's mind went blank. Torpedoes mounted on bombers? They actually mounted torpedoes on bombers. Holding the telegram, Admiral Skier nearly fell, but fortunately, the communications officer and staff officer caught him in time. With the help of the staff, he slowly sat back in his chair and let out a long sigh. Admiral Skier's thoughts were similar to Rear Admiral Cavis's. It's over, everything is over. Since the French possessed such equipment and weapons, did the British have them too? Then, was there any hope for the German Navy? But unlike Rear Admiral Cavis, Admiral Skier's eyes soon regained their vitality. We weren't dealing with the French fleet, but the British Royal Navy, the ultimate target of the German fleet. There was never much hope of breaking through the encirclement, even with a surprise attack. 1 or 2 surprise attacks might succeed, but 3, 4, it was impossible to succeed every time. On the contrary, now, seemingly at a dead end, there was actually a way out. Admiral Skier's thinking became increasingly clear, and then he stood up abruptly and ordered, "Prepare the planes, I'm going to Berlin." Berlin, Sanssouci Palace. Under the afternoon sun, the snow melted faster, and everything seemed to regain its vitality. Even the fountains, frozen for months, began to spout water. However, the atmosphere in the drawing room was unusually oppressive. Wilhelm II and Falkenhayn sat facing each other on the sofa, their brows furrowed. Wilhelm II seemed to have become accustomed to failure. At this moment, he no longer flew into rage over a single setback. After a long silence, Wilhelm II finally said in a muffled voice, "This is unbelievable. The French fleet actually defeated the first fast fleet, despite such a vast difference in strength." Falkenhayn raised an eyebrow. "Just as I said, Your Majesty, we shouldn't consider Charles our opponent, whether it's the army or the navy." Wilhelm II grunted in agreement, his face somewhat grim. Falkenhayn had indeed reminded him, as had Admiral Skier. "Charles is the one who can hold the war by the throat," Falkenhayn said solemnly. "Whether it's equipment, tactics, or some kind of foresight," Falkenhayn actually meant to say that Charles seemed to know the future. But this wasn't something a normal person would say. "Don't worry, Chief of the General Staff," Wilhelm II replied at the time. "I believe that in the Navy, Charles's capabilities are very limited." However, Wilhelm II realized he had been too arrogant. A bomber carrying torpedoes suddenly appeared on the battlefield, shocking everyone just as tanks had appeared on the battlefield before. At this moment, Admiral Skier pushed open the door and entered. To Wilhelm II's fury, Admiral Skier showed no remorse or guilt, but rather a smug grin. Wilhelm II gritted his teeth and asked coldly, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "What's there to be happy about, Admiral? If I hadn't received the telegram, I would have thought you'd just won a battle." Admiral Skier calmly bowed to Wilhelm II. "Your Majesty, I believe Charles made another mistake." "Another mistake?" Wilhelm II scoffed. "I remember you thought Charles made a mistake last time. You thought Charles didn't know we had bombers, so he could confidently find weaknesses in their defenses. It turns out this wasn't Charles's mistake, but ours." Wilhelm II's voice grew louder, until he was practically roaring at Admiral Skier. Although he knew it wasn't Admiral Skier's fault, he couldn't tolerate his attitude. Admiral Skier remained unperturbed, calmly replying, "Your Majesty, I don't know if you've considered this. If Skier can defeat us with a combination of cruisers, destroyers, and bombers armed with torpedoes, does that mean we can also defeat the Royal Navy with the same combination and method?" Wilhelm II and Falkenhayn were stunned. Then Wilhelm II suddenly laughed. In other words, we should upgrade our bombers and mass-produce them. Chapter 647, A gift in return for Charles. Buckingham held a conservative view of Admiral Skier's assessment. General, he asked, we're all worried about one thing, if the British also acquire this technology, or will acquire it in the future, and given their powerful navy, won't our situation be even less optimistic? With that, Buckingham turned the nautical chart on the coffee table around, but this time it was facing not Admiral Skier, but Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II saw this clearly. The excitement on his face gradually faded, replaced by worry. Yes, Wilhelm II said thoughtfully, once the British possess this technology, they can use these bombers to blockade the English Channel and their northern outlets. They won't even need to deploy their main fleet there. Admiral Skier, however, maintained his confident smile. Your Majesty, Chief of the General Staff, do you think Skier would hand this technology over to the British? What do you mean? Wilhelm II countered, his gaze filled with incomprehension. France and Britain were allies. Shouldn't sharing technology with the British be the natural course of action? Admiral Skier calmly took out his briefcase, pulled out a document, and handed it to Wilhelm II, saying with composure, Your Majesty, this is a report on the recent cooperation between the French and British Royal Fleets. I've learned something illogical. The British destroyers haven't been able to detect submarines like the French destroyers. Wilhelm II, who was looking at the document, raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Yes, absolutely sure. Admiral Skier nodded. I've also learned that Charles is expanding his shipping insurance business and has agreed to allow insured shipping companies, including British ones, to join the French convoy escort. Wilhelm II instantly understood, a shrewd fellow. This will bring him huge profits. Buckingham saw more than just profits. In other words, Charles is unlikely to hand over submarine detection technology to the British. Of course, Admiral Skier's answer was certain. If he did, Charles's insurance business would suffer, the British fleet would steal his business, and might even exclude the French fleet. Yes, Wilhelm II agreed. The British have always wanted to exclude the French fleet, but now they have no choice but to involve it in the escort missions, and deeply at that, Buckingham suddenly realized, so, while the French and British fleets are allies on the surface, they are actually competitors. That's fair to say, Admiral Skier emphasized. I'm not sure about the French Parliament's attitude. Many of them have been bought off by the British. They will betray French interests and side with Britain. But Charles, Buckingham interrupted, Charles cannot be bought off by Britain. Wilhelm II was puzzled. Why not, Your Majesty? Buckingham replied, if someone has the ability to control the entire country's military, politics, and commerce, and even potentially control Parliament to serve their own purposes, do you think he could be bought off by Britain? Wilhelm II instantly understood. He is the emperor of this country. He represents the interests of France. If he could be bought off by Britain, he would be the biggest fool. Buckingham nodded. Yes, that person is Charles. France can almost be considered his property, though not now, but it is very likely to become so in the near future, and if France is his property, he certainly cannot sell it out. That would be going against himself, Admiral Skier added. Not only that, he is also a natural enemy of Britain, because Britain does not want France to rise to power under Skier's leadership, or even surpass her. Wilhelm I's eyes widened, his whole body trembling with excitement, and he almost dropped the documents in his hands. Did I hear that right? You mean we can, possibly become allies of Skier? Buckingham glanced at Admiral Skier with envy, his voice tinged with sorrow and loss. This, perhaps, is limited to the Navy, Your Majesty. Wilhelm I understood what he meant. At sea, France and Germany faced a powerful enemy together, the British Royal Navy, thus making allies possible. But on land, Germany still occupied large swathes of French territory and had even attempted to invade Paris a year ago. How could they possibly be allies? But Wilhelm I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Even so, it's enough. It's unbelievable that we've become allies of the Charles. Then, as if remembering something, Wilhelm I asked Admiral Skier with a worried expression, have we made a mistake? I mean, we should have attacked the Royal Navy, not raided the Charles's escort fleet. Will the Charles change its mind because of this, thus affecting our... Wilhelm I wanted to say the word cooperation, but found that the word seemed inappropriate. No, Your Majesty, Admiral Skier replied, I think quite the opposite. This is precisely the beginning of our cooperation. What? Wilhelm I and Buckingham looked at Admiral Skier simultaneously. Admiral Skier took several telegrams from his bag and handed them over, explaining, Your Majesty, these are telegrams from the reconnaissance planes and Rear Admiral Carvis. Rear Admiral Carvis believed the French fleet had the capacity to expand their gains, but they did not. Meanwhile, our reconnaissance planes also discovered that another bomber squadron was not engaged in combat on the outskirts, and the squadron was confirmed to be carrying torpedoes. Wilhelm I's face instantly lit up with delight. Does this mean Admiral Skier showed leniency? Admiral Skier nodded, a smile on his face. If the French fleet's decision not to expand their gains was to protect merchant ships, then the bombers' lack of engagement was quite certain. Falkingham's gaze shifted from the telegram to Admiral Skier. Do you have a feeling that Skier's deployment of torpedo bombers at this time is a warning to us? Yes, Admiral Skier replied. So this isn't a mistake on his part, but rather a deliberate move. The purpose is to prompt us to develop bombers, thereby breaking through the British blockade, Admiral Skier concluded. Therefore, Skier certainly wouldn't give this technology to the British. It's not in his interest, nor in France's. Wilhelm I, increasingly convinced, stood up abruptly, his tone resolute. Develop bombers immediately, the sooner the better. This is our opportunity, perhaps our last. We must not let it slip away, he added. Furthermore, submarines and fast fleets should target the British convoys. This was Wilhelm I's return gift to Skier. Attacking only the British convoys and not the French fleet would turn Skier's French fleet into a guarantee of quality, and soon merchant ships and supplies would be under Skier's control. It was also a subtle hint. We know your intentions. We will cooperate with you in attacking the Royal Navy. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 648: The Unsuccessful Plan. Because merchant ships were observing the naval battle at close range, news spread rapidly. That afternoon, newspapers from various countries published special supplements detailing the victory. The military's Le Monde remained as understated as ever. It offered little commentary on the battle, simply publishing a few images taken from warship and bomber perspectives of German ships being sunk, especially the battle cruiser Sedlife, which was described in detail across an entire page. The headline read, "Salute to the brave officers and men fighting on the front lines. Your victory is the pride of all French citizens." Other newspapers had no access to the photographs, not even those taken from the merchant ships. At that time, ordinary people rarely owned cameras, and taking photos in such a setting could easily be interpreted as espionage. However, Le Petit Journal still managed to utilize its expertise, providing a cartoon of bombers carrying torpedoes, with several warships sinking below. The article read, "This is undoubtedly another exhilarating victory. Our brilliant inventor, Charles, has unexpectedly taken torpedoes into the sky. Do you know what this means? Naval warfare may be rewritten. It's no longer just a battle between warships, their opponent is also aircraft. Unbelievable. No one expected aircraft to become an adversary of battleships, their costs differing by hundreds or even thousands of times." All of France was stunned by this news. The younger generation reacted relatively calmly. Many didn't realize the significance of this victory, simply regarding it as another one of Charles's victories. But the middle-aged and elderly were overwhelmed with excitement. They were the generation that bore the brunt of the French Navy's decline, believing they would never see its resurgence, even with Charles's presence. But suddenly, one day, they realized victory and hope were right before them, so real they could hardly believe it. Many were moved to tears, reading the newspapers over and over, then buying every newspaper imaginable, always hoping to find something different. The Times of London. "This is undoubtedly a major victory. We have once again defeated the German fleet's surprise attack, but regrettably, the victor is not the Royal Navy, but the French fleet, the fleet we once despised. But the key point is that they actually sank a German battle cruiser with their aircraft. Does this mean they can also sink our battleships with their aircraft? Although I believe the French wouldn't do that, we still need to consider a question. What are the advantages of the Royal Navy? Are we still the world's most powerful navy?" American newspapers reported on this only briefly, because Americans at this time were generally still bound by the Monroe Doctrine, concerned only with their own development and not with a war outside the Americas. But upon seeing the reports, Colonel Johnson immediately submitted a report to his superiors. "I believe we should immediately develop bombers capable of carrying torpedoes. If we don't have them, we should buy them. It's worth the cost, no matter how much." Because this is likely the future direction of naval warfare, he then exclaimed, God, Charles is ahead of the curve again. I really hope he comes to America. If you were here, we would have the whole world. In central London, at the War Office building. Although it was late at night, the building was still brightly lit, with staff officers and communications personnel working busily. Meals were being delivered to each office by guards. Orders were being relayed, confirm whether the bombers are indeed carrying torpedoes, and which type of aircraft, immediately begin experiments with Caproni bombers carrying torpedoes, send someone to contact Charles, if possible, acquire torpedo bombers at all costs. In an office on the third floor facing the inner garden, First Lord of the Admiralty Balfour was frantically working through a pile of documents. The image above shows Balfour, who served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1902 to 1905, First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, and later, as Secretary of State for Ireland, brutally suppressed the Irish independence movement, earning him the nickname Bloody Balfour. He is best known for the Balfour Declaration, which proposed the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in 1917. The Shire's victory was a nightmare for the Royal Navy. Bombers carrying torpedoes attacked warships with incredible speed and precision, leaving the ships with almost no time to react. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Balfour was forced to urgently assess this method of warfare to determine the future direction of the Navy. Your Excellency, a staff officer suddenly handed him a document. This is an unsuccessful plan left by the former First Lord of the Admiralty. Balfour took the document, glanced at it, and instantly stared at the staff officer, widening his eyes. Are you sure this is real? Yes, the staff officer replied. This is an experiment conducted 14 years ago. The former First Lord of the Admiralty had also experimented with aircraft carrying torpedoes, but only conducted it once, failing and then abandoning it completely. Bring him here immediately, Balfour ordered. The former First Lord of the Admiralty is now the Quartermaster Minister, and their offices are on the same floor. A moment later, the Quartermaster Minister appeared in Balfour's office, a cigar emitting wisps of smoke, seemingly quite drunk. His face was flushed crimson under the light. What is it, Sir Balfour? The Quartermaster Minister asked, glancing around at the surrounding furnishings, his breath reeking of alcohol. This used to be my office, he thought. Balfour tossed a file onto the desk. This is the experiment you conducted in 2014. The Quartermaster Minister casually flipped through it, replying, Oh, I almost forgot. Indeed, but at the time, it was considered impossible. Impossible, Balfour narrowed his eyes. But now it's reality. Did he know that the Royal Navy might have missed an opportunity to dominate the world? If Britain had discovered this technology first and devoted all its efforts to developing it, they wouldn't be in this embarrassing situation today. I know, the Quartermaster replied, flipping to the last page of the document and emphasizing it with his finger. You should look at this conclusion, sir. The aircraft at the time was too light, only 80 horsepower, yet it carried a 600-kilogram torpedo. When the torpedo was launched into the sea, the aircraft instantly lost balance, nearly crashing and killing everyone on board. Balfour took the document and examined it carefully. Indeed, as the Quartermaster said, it was a failed experiment, considered impossible by everyone, and thus kept secret. After a moment, Balfour asked with difficulty, Do you think this poses a threat to our Navy? The Quartermaster smiled. That's what you need to consider, sir. You are the First Lord of the Navy. I, the Quartermaster, am concerned with escort duties. Chapter 649 Lifeline at Sea. At the Hasselt city government, Albert I was overseeing the resettlement of prisoners and the construction of defensive lines. Charles's armored corps was better suited as a mobile force. In principle, they should have been positioned on the second line, waiting to infiltrate rather than constructing trenches and confronting the enemy on the front lines. Therefore, once the fighting stabilized, the defensive lines were immediately handed over to Albert I. At this time, Albert I was deeply engrossed in a mountain of paperwork, and what was recently causing him considerable headaches was the supply of provisions for the prisoners. Charles had captured over 100,000 German soldiers in the Battle of Antwerp, and over 200,000 more during the Hasselt infiltration. Adding to those captured during peacetime, the number of prisoners remaining in Belgium exceeded 500,000. This was a considerable burden for Belgium, which was already facing wartime shortages. Especially since a significant portion of these prisoners were those whom Charles had promised to treat well. I think the British should share some of the burden, Albert I complained, frowning. They control the shipping lanes and the supplies. Yet they ignore the needs of the prisoners. I raised this with Field Marshal Kitchener. Major General Eden replied helplessly. But the Marshal believes we can organize the prisoners to work and support themselves. Easier said than done, Albert I scoffed. It's wartime. We can't even feed our own soldiers at the front, let alone harvest crops quickly. If these guys don't give us supplies soon, I'll send the prisoners back to Germany. Just then, a staff officer brought in a telegram. Your Majesty, a telegram from Antwerp. I heard that Charles led the Air Force and the French Navy to victory in the North Sea. Is that so? Albert I replied casually. He assumed it was just a minor victory. After all, it was the French Navy. Even the Royal Navy couldn't handle the German Navy. What could the French Navy possibly achieve? However, after glancing at the telegram, his eyes widened instantly. He looked up at his staff in astonishment. Are you sure this is true? 7 German warships sank, including a battle cruiser. Yes, Your Majesty, the staff officer replied. I specifically sent someone to verify this with General Charles. Then, Albert I still couldn't believe it. How many losses did the French fleet suffer? If the French fleet suffered greater losses, it couldn't be called a victory. I heard only 3 warships were damaged, the staff officer replied. 1 cruiser was seriously damaged, and 2 destroyers were slightly damaged. Albert I was stunned for a long time before he could react. No, this is impossible. Rear Admiral Eden also couldn't believe it. He stepped forward, took the telegram, and looked at it, but it was indeed true. How did Charles do that? Albert I asked, his face full of surprise. He knew that naval warfare was different from land warfare. Naval tactics were usually very simple. Apart from the T formation to maximize fleet firepower, it was all about armor and gunnery clashing head-on. Therefore, Albert I couldn't understand why this had happened, even though Charles was in command of the battle. It was Charles's bombers, the staff officer answered. He used bombers carrying torpedoes to attack the German battle cruisers from the air. The Germans were caught off guard and suffered heavy losses. Albert I and Rear Admiral Eden exchanged bewildered glances. Torpedoes in the air? Typical Charles. Suddenly, Albert I burst into laughter. I knew he could do it. He did it. It proves my choice was correct, General. Absolutely correct. Eden was bewildered. Your Majesty, it's just a naval battle. Charles has achieved many victories. This is just one of them. This is a naval battle, General. This is a naval battle. Albert I grabbed Rear Admiral Eden's shoulders and shook him heavily, as if trying to wake him. Do you know what a naval victory means? Do you know what the appearance of these torpedo-laden bombers means? Rear Admiral Eden was completely confused. Having come from an army background, he was more concerned with Belgian territory. He didn't quite understand the importance of the ocean. Look at this. Albert I excitedly pulled over a map and placed it in front of Major General Eden, pointing to the English Channel and saying, the entire Belgian coastline is blocked within the English Channel. Major General, didn't you think of anything? After looking at the map and thinking for a while, Major General Eden seemed to understand. Your Majesty means, Major General Eden hesitated, that we are still subject to the British Royal Navy. Yes, King Albert I nodded. We have decided to fully support the Charles, but the Charles and Britain have some irreconcilable conflicts, including our own. Before this, I was worried about the threat from the sea. Although we have fortresses and the defensive systems built by the Charles, these systems can only defend against land attacks, not threats from the sea. Major General Eden, staring at the map, agreed. Yes, Antwerp's last resort is even its only escape route by sea. Once blockaded by enemy warships, our fortresses will be targets for battleship guns. There's also the issue of supplies, King Albert I added, and foreign trade, of course. Major General Eden nodded. Foreign trade is the foundation of Belgium's economy. Its development model involves importing large quantities of raw materials from abroad, processing them, and then exporting them worldwide. More than 50% of its industrial output needs to be exported by sea. Therefore, sea routes are undoubtedly Belgium's lifeline. Things are different now, Albert I laughed heartily. Charles has taken torpedoes into the air and has an airport in Antwerp. Albert I pointed to Antwerp on the map and drew a circle to demonstrate the bomber's control range. Major General Eden suddenly understood. In the near future, control of the English Channel would no longer belong to Britain, but to France, or more precisely, to Charles. Originally, Albert I had a slight fear of Britain. He worried that if Britain were to lower itself and place the world's best navy on the Belgian coastline, Belgium, a small country with no strategic depth, would collapse instantly. Even without a military blockade, Belgium couldn't withstand an economic embargo. But now, Albert I's last bit of fear was gone. The English Channel would belong to Charles in the future, and Britain's powerful navy might not even be able to enter the Channel. Clinging to Charles's coattails was better than having to depend on Britain, France, and Germany, or even being caught in the middle. Albert I was in a great mood. Prepare the car, we're going to Antwerp right away. Chapter 650 provides funding for the Navy. Antwerp Airport Command Center. Vice Admiral Charles and Vice Admiral Gaplitz are discussing the future direction of the French Navy. Our destroyers, influenced by the Green Water Navy, have always been primarily small-scale, Vice Admiral Gaplitz said worriedly. We previously only produced 800-ton destroyers. We only got this size because Argentina ordered 1,000-ton destroyers. Charles, having reviewed the relevant materials, recalled it as a disgrace to the French Navy. In 1910, Argentina simultaneously ordered 1,000-ton destroyers from Britain, France, and Germany. However, French construction was slow and sea trials yielded poor results, leading Argentina to cancel the order. Ultimately, France could only keep this 1,000-ton destroyer for its own use. This was the French Adventure-class destroyer, the most advanced destroyer France produced during World War I. The image above shows a French Adventurer-class destroyer, commissioned in 1914, with a standard displacement of 1,000 tons. The problem now is, Vice Admiral Gaplitz handed Charles the destroyer data, that many of us are unsure whether destroyers should continue with a trend towards smaller sizes or larger ones. Charles had previously discussed the future development of the Navy with Wells regarding destroyers, but hadn't pinpointed which direction they should take, leading to this disagreement within the Navy. Charles stated confidently, "Of course, it's better to develop them larger. 1,000 tons is far from enough. In the future, we need to develop 2,000 tons, 3,000 tons, and even larger." "Why?" Gaplitz asked, puzzled. "If that's the case, what's the difference between them and light cruisers?" During World War I, light cruisers generally displaced between 4,000 and 5,000 tons, seemingly overlapping in tonnage. However, Charles knew they were not the same thing. "General," Charles replied, "we all know that light cruisers, including larger ones, primarily target enemy warships." "Right, of course," Vice Admiral Gaplitz nodded. "They operate in conjunction with the battleships, utilizing their speed advantage to seize advantageous positions. Therefore," Charles said, "their primary focus remains on armor and guns." "Right, what's wrong with that?" Vice Admiral Gaplitz looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. What else could naval warfare involve but enemy warships? Charles didn't answer, but calmly looked at Vice Admiral Gaplitz and asked, "When torpedo bombers appear, the function of warships will change accordingly, won't it?" Vice Admiral Gaplitz hummed in agreement. "Obviously, it should enhance its anti-aircraft firepower, just enhance it." Charles smiled without saying a word. Lieutenant General Gaplitz looked bewildered. "Then, what else could it be?" Charles replied, "Today it's bombers carrying torpedoes. One day we can even load bombs onto bombers. Although it currently has accuracy issues, those will be resolved eventually, and with improved accuracy, doesn't that mean the fleet will often be sunk by enemy aircraft before it even sees the enemy?" Lieutenant General Gaplitz was stunned. What Charles said was hard to imagine, but upon deeper reflection, Lieutenant General Gaplitz realized he was right. At least in the special waters of the North Sea, which is 643 kilometers wide, a Caproni bomber with external fuel tanks could almost fly back and forth. The same is true for the La Manche Strait, which is only 180 kilometers wide at its widest point. There's no need to consider range at all. Even the short-legged camel fighter could fly back and forth. So, could enemy warships even see their opponents? Before they could even see their opponents, French reconnaissance would discover their positions, followed by a barrage of torpedo bombers and bombers. Charles then added, "If enemy warships can't even see each other, what's the point of cannons and armor?" Vice Admiral Gaplitz considered for a moment, then thoughtfully replied, "I understand. The focus of destroyer development should be air defense, not anti-ship." Charles nodded. This was the direction for warship development from then on. This was especially true after the advent of aircraft carriers. Battleships with their various calibers of main and secondary guns became obsolete. Because the primary mission of warships wasn't anti-ship warfare, and in most naval battles, enemy warships weren't even visible, what use were so many main guns? They were reduced to one or two main guns for extreme situations. Thick armor also became useless. The main attacks came from the air, not the sea. Bombers attacked the decks from above, or torpedo bombers launched torpedoes below the waterline. Fixed side armor was futile. Instead, various anti-aircraft weapons were deployed, providing multiple layers of protection for the aircraft carrier. Of course, as escorts to aircraft carriers, destroyers must also be capable of anti-submarine and anti-ship warfare, but air defense is relatively secondary. This is why battleships were eventually phased out. Their main advantages, guns and armor, became largely superfluous and useless after the advent of aircraft carriers. Therefore, it was inevitable that battleships would be replaced by destroyers, which were primarily designed for air defense. Note, during World War II, many warships had to have their secondary guns removed and replaced with anti-aircraft guns due to changes in the battlefield and missions. So, Charles concluded, the increase in destroyer tonnage is completely different from that of cruisers. Its primary objective is air defense. Simply put, it's about gradually replacing the weight of cruiser armor and guns with anti-aircraft firepower. Vice Admiral Gappert's expression shifted between joy and worry. After a long pause, he sighed and said, "This is good news, but also bad news." "Oh?" Charles asked with interest. "Why?" Vice Admiral Gappert replied, "The good news is that if future naval warfare develops as you say, then our losses will be much less than those of Britain and Germany, and we still have hope of catching up with them." Charles nodded in understanding. France didn't have many battleships, while Britain and Germany each had dozens or even a dozen. Once naval warfare abandoned battleships, Britain and Germany would inevitably suffer greater losses. Vice Admiral Gappert continued, "The bad news is that our naval construction is almost at a standstill. We simply don't have the resources to develop new destroyers. Since the outbreak of war, France has poured almost all its funds into the army, leaving the navy as second only, with a mere 2 destroyers under construction." Charles didn't hesitate and agreed. "I think I can contribute in this regard," Charles said. "I mean, the Bernard Group can provide funding for the Navy." Vice Admiral Gappert's eyes lit up. Are you sure you want to do this?" "Of course," Charles answered confidently. This was a golden opportunity to control the Navy. How could he easily let it slip by? End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.